All right, well, we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This will be the budget meeting number 2. So at this time, do we need to do a roll call? Nope, no roll call. All right, we'll just turn it over to you,
All right.
Mr. City Manager.
Hopefully this works. Okay. So, purpose of the meeting today is to get through the second draft and hopefully get the council down to the end where we can make some decision points or some decisions and guidance for putting together the final draft of the budget. With the way the calendar works out, and we'll go through this in more detail later, but the driving piece for when the budget has to be adopted is the submission deadline to the state. It's got to be in by March 15th every year. We always try to hold our public hearing at the first March meeting for the City Council, the first Thursday meeting of the year. Budgets are unique in that their publication requirement is between 10 and 20 days ahead of the hearing instead of the normal 4 and 20 like you'd have for public hearings on ordinances or zoning changes or anything like that. So the first part of this is just going to be setting some context for the council before we get into talking about some of the more detailed changes between the first and second drafts of the budget. So looking at Marion as a community, I don't think it's any secret to anybody that we've been growing. Between 2010 and 2019, where we've shown about 18% growth. Now, the thing that I want to point out about that is that the prior 10-year period, we showed 32% growth, but the number of people has been very consistent across that period of time. But starting from the lower base, starting from that 25 or 26,000 population and moving up to 35,000, the percentage growth is going to look more impressive than it has been. So the rate of growth, as far as the number of new people that we add, the number of new units has actually stayed pretty steady during that period of time. During that same period, we have also annexed roughly 2 square miles into the city, developed 1,314 acres, and that's been 147 subdivisions and over 1,750 lots. So when you think about the growth of the community, I know we talk about it a lot, but in practical terms, it's kind of staggering to actually see it on the screen for where the community has grown and realize just how much we have actually added to the city over that period of time. So as you might expect, our property valuation has grown at the same time. As a percentage, the valuation's grown by 54%. During the same time, the property tax budget went up by 51%. And that's just on the general fund side, not property taxes for debt service or anything else. So that's strictly what's getting funneled through the general fund. Here's where we've seen pretty significant changes with the capital projects budget. As I think council knows, this is being driven by a number of factors, but the primary one is just so much maintenance that we have that's coming our direction related to infrastructure that's now 50 and 60 years old, and certainly building projects, city facilities have an impact on that as well. So the capital projects budget shows almost 500% growth, while debt service is just a little under 200% during that period of time. So overall, during that same time, this is what our staff growth has looked like over that period. It might be a little hard to see on here, but blue is consolidated positions on public safety, orange is culture and recreation, the light blue is community development, yellow is general government, the gray is public services, and then the green is engineering. So I'll point out a few things here, like if you look at engineering, for example, in 2014, engineering added 2 personnel. That's related to when the local option sales tax was renewed. We actually put on an engineer and a project manager position strictly because we were throwing another $4 million a year worth of projects into their laps. So we did add some staff in there. In the yellow one on the general government, one of the biggest growth drivers there has been IT. During that same period of time, we've also added human resources, we've added a communications function, and have actually separated out some of those different pieces that in the past were being handled by one person. On culture and recreation, a lot of that growth has been in the Parks Department as they've become responsible for more parks, more total acres. We have added some staff in there. And then on the public safety side, it's been a combination of officers, some additions to communications, and then also on the fire side. So here's how it looks on the part-time end. Part-time is generally driven by only a couple of departments. The library and the parks department are the two biggest centers that we have for the part-time side. It does vary a lot from year to year, especially on the park side, depending on how many program offerings that we do. There's a lot of coach positions, for example, that might be 5 hours a month or something like that. So the number of things that you offer can really drive those numbers. Library tends to be more steady as far as their breakdown of part-time personnel. But other than that, once you get outside of those, there's not a lot for part-time staff in the other ones. Public service does maintain a small core of part-time staff. Typically, that would be the people that staff your recycling station, staff the compost center, fill in on the weekends for those types of things. And then engineering does have part-time personnel that they will bring in. That's generally your summer help that'll come in. I think they typically have them go out and do like the sidewalk assessments and some of those other tasks that are fairly time intensive, but that you don't necessarily need to have your licensed engineers going out and doing. And we'll provide council with copies of all the slides and everything, so don't worry about that. But here's the overall breakdown of part-time staff. Again, when you look at this, the gray is library, yellow is parks, blue is recreation, and green is pool. So if you look at the amount of the circle that those four pieces take up, it's clearly the bulk of our investment. And this is a comparison over time of how our staffing is broken down by the different functions that the city does. And so if you look back to 2010, for example, we had about 12% of our full-time personnel were in culture and recreation. In 2010, or excuse me, I think that's 2020, that's up to 13%. So just a percentage change. Public safety collectively was sitting at 50% and right now is sitting at 49%. So as far as the overall complement of staff, they've been pretty steady over time. There has been growth in general government from 4% to 8%, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about that here coming up next. So here's the breakdown of what would be considered to be the general government staff. If you look back to 2010, you had 2 people full-time in the city manager's office. That's a little misleading because it was actually 2 full-time and 1 3/4-time position. We upgraded the 3/4-time position to a full-time position, and that was the initial transition from 2 over to 3. Finance had 3 personnel, and again, same thing. They had a permanent part-time position in there that was upgraded to full-time. So it wasn't a complete addition of new staff. It was an incremental change. That one and a couple of other ones around the city were made in reaction to basically changes that were forced because of the Affordable Health Care Act. We had a choice to go through the organization and look at either reducing hours to stay below the threshold to where people would qualify for benefits, or in I think 4 cases, we actually went ahead and bit the bullet and upgraded the position from 30 hours a week to 40 hours a week and made them full-time. So this is the one that really shows you the new functions that have been added to the city over the last several years. Communications was the first one. We brought Amber on in 2012. We learned a few lessons with some plans that we brought forward that our former methods of communicating with the public weren't really up to snuff, and there was a strong sentiment on the city council to decide that we needed to have some professional help to be able to upgrade that and really increase our presence, increase our communication with the community, and so that was a priority position. In 2013, we hired our first IT person. That was Terrell. We brought Terrell on board because we were faced with a couple of different things. Either we were going to have to significantly increase the amount that we were contracting out for IT services, or we were going to have to start bringing that function in-house. When we looked at it and we looked at the amount of service that we got for the investment that we were going to create, we went ahead and created the function and started bringing IT on board, and we've slowly built that one up over over the years. In most cases, it's really been about a balance of taking a look at what we're spending on contract services versus bringing it in-house. So, for example, when we brought a network engineering position in-house, we had a contract with Marco, our current outside provider, for $80,000 a year. That got us 16 hours a week of a loaned network engineer from one of their personnel. So we brought that position in-house and brought him on and had him available for 40 hours a week to serve all the departments. There was a little bit of a cost increase to us to do that, but the amount of time that we had was dramatically increased. HR, we started that one in 2016, brought that out as a separate piece. That had formerly been combined with payroll. And I know the council is keenly aware that the workload of payroll for the organization compared to a city that had 100 people, now when you've got 225 and you're looking at another 75 to 85 part-time during the summer, we're still handling that with one payroll person, much like we used to be. And then finally, in 2019, we'd added the budget manager position, and initially it added the director of administrative services. I would point out that the director of administrative services actually replaced the former finance director position. So while it would show as a gain overall to general government, it was a repurposing of other resources in the organization. So during that overall period of time, you can really kind of see how the breakdown has been added to the internal pieces, and most of it has been related to breaking out areas of specialization that formerly were handled by people that were just doing general work. I used to have to do a lot of the HR stuff. Beth handled a lot of the HR stuff before we broke that out as a separate function. So when you look at the budgets by function over time, here's a comparison. So you can look at 2010, what 2019 looks like, and then what's proposed for 2020. It's a little hard to tell just because the scale of the different pieces in here kind of collapses it a little bit. Capital projects, again, no secret, is the one that has seen the largest increase in there. On the business functions, the enterprise side, that's being largely driven by the public services facilities project and the conversion of the fleet. You would not expect to see that large of a change over there otherwise. You can see that debt service has increased quite a bit over that period of time. General government has not changed very much. Community and economic development hasn't changed much. Culture and recreation, public works and public safety, a lot of those ones that have direct links to the physical size of the community, you have seen some significant change over time. So then from there, I wanted to start getting into the specifics of the changes between the first and second draft of the budget. So overall, on the revenue side, we have reduced the revenues by a little over $250,000. Most of that was due to a couple of changes. We really honed in on the amount that we were proposing to increase health insurance and actually leveled that out. And by the time you take that out, looking at the original estimates in there, that's about half of that difference. Now that had a direct impact on the property tax levy. That does mean that we are taking a little bit more risk. Now, we are self-insured, so when Wellmark or Gallagher give us a proposed rate increase, they're taking a look and saying, here's what your trend looks like. We're going to take a look at it using our set of actuarial standards and tell you what we think your recommended rates would be. So that money gets collected, it goes into our self-insurance pool, pays out claims, and then we also use part of it to buy a stop-loss policy for any claims over $30,000. We also use part of it to pay Wellmark for administering our healthcare program on our behalf. So the risk that you take is that claims would outpace what either Gallagher or what Wellmark would estimate they should be. Gallagher is usually a little bit more conservative anyway because they take a look at what are you carrying in your health fund balance. Wellmark looks at it strictly from what do you need to do it if you're doing it strictly on cash flow and we don't consider that you're holding any reserves. So this is not something that we would recommend doing for a long period of time because a budget year or two, especially a year like this one where Gallagher was estimating a fairly small premium to begin with, they were thinking that For example, if we'd done their premium increase, it only would have been about $19,000 across the whole city. So that's an acceptable level of risk. But you do it 2 or 3 years in a row and start to draw against that fund balance, you're positioning yourself that all of a sudden you have to do a 7 or a 9% increase in 1 year. And we've tried to be a lot more steady and much more incremental about it than that. So we're looking at the health insurance fund being able to absorb that weight, that increase. You're also seeing the impact of the reductions from the first draft in the overall pay-for-performance program. That also then in turn reduces contributions to retirements. It reduces your Medicare and Social Security contributions. So all of those roll-ups that are driven by wage rates see a reduction as well. So that's why if you start going through line item in each individual general fund budget, every one of them will show reductions in some of those line items related to staffing expenses. We are proposing to stagger the hiring of staff. Now, again, we know that we're going to have to deal with the full cost of doing that in the following year. The one that has the most significant impact is looking at delaying when we would bring on the last round of firefighters. When we get to looking at the individual budgets, we can tell you what that number is so that you know where we're sitting at with that. We also then corrected a couple of places where revenue was being booked and moved it out. One of the things that I've tried to do when I take a look at the general fund is just make sure that we're not unnecessarily routing expenses through the general fund. So if you looked back 10 years ago, you would have seen that hotel motel was being receipted into the general fund and being spent out of the general fund. We've moved that off into a fund of its own. So when we have opportunities to do things like that and route things to more appropriate accounts, we always take a look at that. So for this year, we are looking at any of the cost of benefits for disability retirees out of the 411 system would come directly from the health insurance fund rather than being routed through the general fund. So on the revenue increase side, there were some adjustments. One is that one of the proposed items that's new in the current budget was $20,000 for event sponsorship. The city brought on a part-time event coordinator, and this is above what we normally do for the Parks Department. The Parks Department has come in over the last several years and has been receiving money from Hotel Motel that they use to do the free concert and free event series out at Lau Park. We felt it was necessary that if we're going to have an event coordinator, to have some seed money in there for community events, to use for leverage, to go out and find sponsorships for events, but give opportunities for matching funds and be able to better utilize some of the spaces we have in town. Whether that's Lau, whether it's the stage at the Uptown Artway, whether it's enhancing or creating new events at City Square Park, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to do that, and we wanted to make sure that we were really using our infrastructure. So we pulled that in from Hotel Motel. One of the things that you'll notice is that we've been pretty conservative about estimating increases in hotel motel revenue. We know the new hotel is going to open, don't 100% know when, and we don't know what that first year is going to look like, so I didn't want to overestimate revenues and have temptations to start allocating it to projects or allocating it to things that we might not be able to fund later if, for example, their opening gets delayed 6 months or they don't hit what their original targets were for occupancy. So we're trying to be conservative on that. With the transit levy, we did make a couple of changes to that. As we investigated it further, the transit levy allows the city to levy taxes for the operations, maintenance, and costs associated with a transit system. One of the things that is growing for the Parks Department is maintenance of the stops. We are going to be putting in a lot more enclosures. They are going to require more maintenance, more snow removal, and we asked the Parks Department to estimate what that was going to be, and that was just a hair under $36,000, so $35,780. And then with all the changes to the transit system, with the community growth, we've been doing a lot more work through the planning department with the transit system on figuring out how that's all going to work. So we do have 1/4 of the salary for a planner's position coming out of there as well. That's another $22,394. So those were added in there. That's one of the areas where You can levy costs for direct expenses related to that. That's not a levy, for example, that you could use to invest in public safety. They're very restricted. When we put our budget together, the only one that you have full discretion on what you can use the dollars for is the basic $8.10 levy. That one can be used for any general government purpose. All the other ones are restricted to specific types of expenses. And then we did do an increase in the transfer in from the police and fire pension fund by $20,000 for retirement costs. That's counterbalancing. We have a significant planned retirement coming up in the fire department, and there'll be some expenses associated with that, so we're seeking to cover those. The history on the police and fire pension fund dates back to, I think, the genesis of the 411 retirement system. It's what was left over in our city pension funds that was not needed when the state took that system over. When they took that system over, they included 47 cities, and they went through an exercise to figure out, okay, how much do I need from your pension funds to get the state system started up? And if a city had money left over, they were allowed to keep it, but it had to be used for police and fire pension obligations or employee benefit expenses in the future. On the expenditure side for the general fund, we've got about a $630,000 reduction. Health insurance, as I said, was a significant change on that. Moving the retiree and the disability retiree on the 411 system over to health insurance made a significant change. We did also take out a proposed budget of $20,000 for a special election. We had originally included that in there to have a budget allotment that could be used to put the CIP levy in front of voters. With the discussions that we've had with council, it seemed like there was support that if we were going to put that out in front of the voters, to just do that with the general election in November, which would mean we would not need to hold a special election and wouldn't need to spend that money. So that would be the plan going forward, that we wouldn't need those dollars. From there, you start talking about what did we do for department budgets themselves. So a couple of global changes. We were looking at delays in the start dates of different positions. That saves about $93,000 in cash during the course of the budget year. We moved executime out to capital projects instead of keeping it in the general fund budget. That's about $103,000. The rule for making it a capital project has to do with how expensive it is, but also the estimated life of it. With executime, with our enterprise software, it would exceed both of those, so it is something that could be done out of capital projects instead. We did also, on the police side, the police department, I don't know if they were okay with it, but they allowed us to take out their license plate reader. They made some changes to their training budget and priority dispatch, a scheduling software that they were proposing, and ultimately ended up reducing their additional request by about $101,000. And I do think that's important because, you know, even though we've gone through and we have asked departments to reduce budgets, in a lot of cases they are still going to be receiving more than they had in prior years, but the reduction or the increases have been reduced from the original ask. With pay for performance, we made a couple of changes. I'd already, I think, told the council that we put a cap on the current fiscal year one for all of the department heads at 3.5%, and then that, of course, gets carried forward into your estimates for next year, and then we're budgeting at 3% total in FY20. The other change that we are planning to make on that is that rather than having it be tied to specific positions, it would be treated like a pool. So a department could look at what their total allotment is for pay for performance. If they've got somebody who's been an absolute star performer, they could come in and say, I'd like to go above the 3%, but they're going to be responsible for staying within that overall budget. So there'd be a trade-off. If you want to give somebody 3.25%, it means that somebody else has to take less in order to be able to make that work. So the pay for performance then would be pooled. Overall, that results in about $85,000 in reductions, and that is across all funds, not just general fund, but there's personnel in the enterprise funds that are subject to pay for performance as well. So looking at where did the reductions occur, where did the budget adjustments occur? On the fire department side, we've seen a reduction of about $104,000 from draft 1 to draft 2. That's about 2%. That's related to when the firefighters would be coming on and when the fire station would open. And a decrease in some of the proposed expenditures for new equipment. There is some potential there that we could take a look at that workout equipment and potentially fund that out of the well-being budget if that's not fully allocated with the program change for this year. So that would not be something, though, that would result in an overall expenditure increase across general fund. So the big thing there is, as I keep reminding the council, we need to make sure we're reserving some capacity in FY21 because that's when we'll realize that first full year worth of operating expenses in the building. As we work through all the decision points with the architect and get an idea of overall square footage, what they're putting in for mechanical systems, they'll be able to give us some estimates and model out what those operating costs should look like. And this overall is just a trend for what the budgets have looked like in public safety over time. You can see that the two departments generally track together. The reason that there's a big spike in the blue, which is the fire side, is because in the eyes of the state or our auditors, the equipment reserve fund is considered to be part of the general fund. That gets put in with our general fund reserves. So over those couple of years, we bought a couple of pumper trucks, one of which we paid for and the other which the township paid for, and then, of course, the new ladder truck, which came through the equipment reserve fund. So if those were taken out, these two lines would very closely parallel each other. So with the police department, there was a reduction in the requests of about 1.5%. There's a 1-month delay in the lead communications operator position. That saves about $6,600 in cash over the course of the year. The pay for performance reductions combined 19 and 20 saves about another $14,000. And then with changes in one-time expenses and purchases, that reduced another $116,000 out of the budget.
Lon, could you go back one, please?
Sure.
Could you tell us what the priority dispatch description is, please?
Sure. I think Joe could. Or Rhonda's here.
Joe?
So.
The software that when we get, you got to have staffing to do it. That's the software that will allow us to answer questions and to give care on the phone with callers based on certain criteria. It's called emergency medical, emergency fire dispatch. In my conversations with the budget manager, I think I'll have a very good shot at getting those funds from 911 board this year in the fall. And so without the staff, I mean, we're about a year from really being able to do it, but what we had done last fall was try to get us on a 5-year plan of $25,000 per year, so because it's $125,000 for the software, to get us on a plan. So that reduction there, I think, was okay because I can probably get it from 911 board. I'm hoping in the fall, and then until we get some more staff in there for them to actually do the training. If you don't have 2 people in there, it just doesn't work. You can't stay on the line. So it's kind of the chicken egg type thing. So sorry to belabor it, but we'll be okay with that one. But it does need to be a priority moving into the future if I can't get the funds from the 911 board.
And what's the total cost outlay for that program to The reason I'm asking is because the telephone call that I had received last week was in reference to somebody that was needing some medical attention with that 911. So what's the cost from $1 to $2 for me to pick up that phone, call 911, and they're going to be able to walk me through administrating chest compressions and CPR?
We'll get there in, assuming the staffing additions over the next 5 years are consistent in the communications center. The cost would be the +8 in the staff with the supervision and the additional dispatchers where we can have a 2-person minimum. And then the software for emergency medical and fire and police dispatch is $125,000 total for the software. And then once we obtain it, I'm sure there would be a small fee to update the software every year after that. I am optimistic about those expenses hopefully being incurred by the Lynn County 911 Board at some point, though. Not the salary expenses, but the technology expenses, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'll just, while I got the floor, Councilman Will Brandt will not be in attendance today, so he is
Stuck?
Permanently stuck. Just an FYI.
Okay. Any other questions on that before we move on? Because that puts us into the parks side. And with this one, we did delay the transition from the Utility 1 staff moving from permanent part-time over to full-time for 2 months, so that would start in September instead, and that saves about $25,000 total. And then as we comb through some of the proposed capital outlays, what we did there was some money that was proposed for doing some master parks plans at a couple of locations, and then some lighting upgrades at Butterfield Park. We thought if we consolidated those together, it actually rises to the level of being a capital project, so we would do that and then move it across to the capital projects fund instead. And again, just remember that those parks utility staff is an incremental cost. It's only the incremental cost of going from the current 30 hours a week to 40 hours a week, so the net cost with those two changes is just a little over $31,000 for making that switch. On library, this was one where we did propose an increase from the first to the second. We discovered that when we pushed some expenses over in the software for the staffing side, that had not included diapers expenses on part-time personnel, so we needed to make a correction for that. And then we also added in some dollars for a night shift leader pay that would allow the library to be able to not necessarily, well, essentially what they're having to do now is they're having to bring in all of the full-time professional staff on different shifts, including weekend coverage, evening coverage. This would allow them to have allowances and stipends for someone to be assigned a leadership post on those and get the professional staff onto a more regular schedule. I don't know, Holly or Kelly, if you want to provide any more detail about that. Would you like to know more? Or?
So right now we have our management staff, the leadership staff works. Can you guys hear me?
Hang on, we'll bring you the microphone.
Well, I can come up there. Sorry. Yeah. So right now, we have our management staff is working nights and weekends in addition to also serving on the floor. So I like to use Madeline, our adult services manager. She manages 3 staff members. She serves 3 hours on the floor during the day. She's also assigned to cover a night shift, her regular programs in the weekend. So that makes her time in the office to lead her staff and be able to do her management level work very difficult. And she's just one example out of the 6 staff members. So we're asking for a $2,500 stipend for 4 people to be able to cover a night shift each week on a rotation. It does 2 things for us. It allows us to have a little bit of relief in that management level, but it also allows us to do leadership development and start doing some kind of succession planning so we can start to hire within from a leadership level. So it's 4 people at $2,500 a year that would be assessed to their overall pay. And then, do you want me to talk about temporary staff, summer staff, or?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
And just so the council knows, that model of doing like acting leader pay is consistent with what we would do in fire or police. There's provisions in those agreements, for example, for having an acting lieutenant or someone acting in a different capacity in the absence of someone who's in that position. So it's taking that same model and applying it to the library side. And so overall, by the time you net out some of the other smaller changes and do the reduction for pay for performance, their overall change from the first draft to the second draft is actually about $41,700 more. On City Hall and general buildings, this is an area where we did make some significant changes. This is where executime was budgeted before, and that's about $103,000 for the software purchase, licensing, support, and administration. We also took out some dollars for a City Hall space assessment that had been proposed at $20,000. That cost was actually a lot higher than what the estimates are, and it's something that we're actually looking at doing now using a local architectural firm. What we really are looking for there is what can we do to, knowing that there's no plans to expand this building anytime within the 5-year window of the CIP. City Hall was constructed to be a 3-story building, so it's got the foundations, the HVAC, and everything to support that. But the last time I had cost estimates drawn up, the cost of putting the 3rd floor on was about 90% of what it cost to build the entire building. So what do we do? How do we better utilize our space in the interim? If we're going to continue to look at growing the community, and if staff keeps pace with that, how do we make sure that we're utilizing the space that we have in this building most effectively to be able to keep up with that and not have to put a 3rd floor on? We also had a budget in there for some furniture updates to the council chambers, and those have all been combined and moved over to capital projects. So net reduction in the general fund is about $146,911. On the civil service budget, this is the one that actually contained the health insurance costs for the disability retirees in the past. When you think about the actual activities of our Civil Service Commission, which is managing the hiring process, doing the testing, certifying the lists for the civil service covered departments and positions, it's minuscule compared to what this budget looked like. So what you'll see in the budget now is actually a much more accurate representation of our costs to run that civil service program on an annual basis. So the costs for those health insurance was moved over to the health insurance fund, and we're anticipating that it will absorb that increase in rates. So health insurance fund, as you might expect with all those changes, is showing some shifts as well. The anticipated costs for the health insurance, wellness, and everything is reflected in here. We're anticipating and we're showing an increase in expenditures and also an increase in revenues. Because while for those civil service, for example, those health insurance premiums that were reflected in civil service, those were also counted against the debt service levy. So it's not a case of where you keep the revenue in the general fund but then move the expenses over. So those two follow together. So you do see an increase in revenue. It doesn't quite counterbalance what we would expect to see for the increase in expenditures. We'd end up with a projected fund balance of about $2.85 million. That's in excess of what the reserve recommendations are by our providers. And well-being budget is projected in here as well. We have that programmed in at $130,800. We budget that at $600 per covered or per policy. So it's not per person that's covered underneath a policy, but every insurance policy, and that's how we determine the budget for that. So legislative and civil rights, we made a couple of switches here. I'd already covered the contingency for the special election that was removed. We also then took out a proposed one-time expenditure for dashboarding software. There's packages that can take the information that council is seeing as we're developing our dashboards for projects and actually add that to the website and automate that to make it more transparent to the public. It does come with a cost. We had looked at that to be something that we might be able to implement along with our website updates, but given the pressure on the general fund this year, we pulled that one out. And with Civil Rights Commission, they've always maintained a contingency line item in the event that a case is brought forward that requires local prosecution. Marion has a civil rights ordinance, and in many ways it parallels the state ordinance, but there are some things in our ordinance that are not in the state one. So for example, if something's brought forward, a complaint against the police department or something like that, one, you don't investigate those locally, but two, that's covered by the state code, so the state handles all of that investigation and anything that comes with that. So our only exposure is in the event that something gets brought forward that's covered under our ordinance, but not covered underneath the state one. That would require us to do all the work with it locally. We have a contract with the city of Cedar Rapids. We would utilize their civil rights staff to do that. At the same time, in the legislative budget, we've always had a contingency in there for during those years where we're going to have open union contracts to cover the expenses in case we end up having to go to arbitration with one of the unions. We've never done that since I've been here. There was one year where we started down that path, but we were able to achieve a settlement in mediation. So what we've done is we've combined those two contingencies into one fund. So we have one contingency line item that could be used for either arbitration or in the event that we have a civil rights investigation, and that resulted in an overall reduction of $15,000.
Lon, can I ask a question?
Yep.
In the event that we do have to exercise that, what replenishes that fund? If those expenses are used up in a litigation, what replenishes it?
It's budgeted as an annual operating expense, so if we don't spend it at the end of the year, it shows up in the general fund reserve that's in excess of 35%. So it's not a case where we set money aside into a particular reserve. We just budget it as an operating expense every year.
Okay, so if we have claim and we have to exhaust that money then is basically reallocated then once it's depleted?
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks.
So here overall is the listing of the positions, and I know this is a little tough to see with the impact of the changes that have been made between the first and second draft. And this shows, the reason we're showing this is because you've got the full impact of positions that were staggered in through 2019, but then you also have the new positions that are proposed for next year. So the changes that were made were shifting back the hiring dates of the civilian or the lead communications operator. We have the civilian property evidence clerk in there as a 7-1 hire, so that one has not been changed. That allows the police department to take a look at their existing staff complement and be able to put that ILEA certified officer out there on the street right away. The lead communications operator would be projected to start on 9/1. It was originally proposed as 8/1, so there's a 1-month change there. We know that they are currently short-staffed. Anytime we've run into an unanticipated retirement or an injury or something else that takes somebody out of duty, it does put additional stress on the department and results in a hit to the overtime budget. Unfortunately, there's just no way to anticipate some of that kind of stuff, especially if it's a workers' comp situation. But moving those, for example, if you look at the chart, moving the firefighters back from a January 1 hire to a March 1 hire saves about $17,500 per position. So moving those three back saves about $51,000, $52,500 in cash during the course of the fiscal year. I wanted to provide a little bit more context because this does, the budget as proposed does still include the accountant position. that would be proposed in there. It'd have a start date of 9/1, and I wanted to give the council a little bit more background on why we're proposing that. This is not the complete list, but if you take a look at what's happened with our financial software and just the amount of money that the city handles, when you think back to those earlier slides that I presented about what's happened in the growth in the general fund, it's grown by 51% in the last 10 years, and we still have virtually the same number of staff handling it. While it showed an upgrade from 3 to 4, that 3 to 4 full-time was actually an 80% part-time that got upgraded to full-time. So the number of people doing that function has stayed virtually unchanged during that entire period of time. We've also seen a significant growth in not only the number of active tax increment financing agreements, but with the law change in 2012, the reporting requirements, what we have to go through to be able to manage those, changed significantly. We also then have more debt issuances that we are tracking. The GASB statements, for those of you more used to the private sector side, that's our version of the governmental accounting standards, or the generally accepted accounting principles. This is how it applies to the local government side, and there's more of them coming. I did want to call out, you just saw the audit finding regarding segregation of duties. Please be under no illusion that adding one person would allow us to get rid of that finding. I don't know that I've ever seen a city that does not have that finding in there. To get down to the level of them feeling like you had adequate separation of duties would require an unaffordable amount of staff for a community our size. But this would allow us to do more segregation of duties and to take over more of those pieces inside. The other piece, frankly, that we really haven't talked about is that for those of you that don't know, Beth has a date for when she's planning on retiring from the community, and we want to be able to have the capacity to bring someone in to shadow Beth, to learn our existing payroll system, but also to work through the implementation of ExecuTime so that once we make the transition from our current Excel-based and New World-based payroll management into doing it in the New World system, that we have somebody that knows how to do that. So we need to be in a position to be able to do some succession planning and be able to know how it's being done now in the event that something unfortunate would happen, but B, also help us manage the transition over to the new system and be ready to hit the ground running when Beth's date does come up. So in the budget memo, we did lay out some alternatives for the City Council. It was clear that there was support on the, at least with several of the council members, for taking a look at what does the budget look like if you do add some patrol positions. And when I had put a number in there, the salary and benefits for an entry-level officer is about $80,000 per officer per year. That does not include the training and outfitting costs, uniform, everything else that it takes to put somebody on the street. That's about $27,000 for somebody from start, getting through the academy, and getting ready to be on the street. So there are different ways that the council could elect to, if you wanted to be able to finance that. The emergency levy can be used for staffing and operating expenses. We have the budget with the franchise fee currently proposed at 3%. The other option would be is we'd have to figure out if you wanted to do some trade-offs within the existing budget to be able to do those expenses. But if you wanted to do two positions, for example, out of the emergency levy, that's about 13 cents to the total levy. That's about $3.75 per household per officer that you add. So each officer is about $3.75 per household.
Lon, I have a question
Sure.
on that one. I don't know where it is in this report, but there was a line item, and maybe this is for Joe because this is maybe in the weeds, but in overtime, there was, 6 figures of overtime for the PD. Would adding another officer significantly reduce overtime? No, it wouldn't offset that.
Now, one officer at this point, unfortunately, we're down a couple right now, so it might make a little bit of an impact, but it's not going to reduce the overall budgeted number that you would see in there, unfortunately.
Thanks.
And I do think it's important that, when we look at something like that, that does just take a look at the police department's position. There are opportunity costs for putting your resources into one department versus looking at another one. When I put the budget together, I always do my best to balance out the competing needs of the different departments and take a look at which ones are going to best serve the community. So I didn't have any issues with with proposing that lead dispatcher position. We know that they are short-staffed right now, and that there's clearly a need in that department to start moving that direction, but also that's one that serves multiple departments in the city, so it has a broad-based impact on the community. At the same time, I would not propose using the emergency levy to fund an accounting position.
When do you want to start having discussions on these topics as we go through this, or do you plan on having a discussion over this whole proposal at the end?
There'll be some decision points at the end that would include some of these. The next section is moving into the enterprise and proprietary fund changes. So if there's any questions on the general fund side, we could take some time here to be able to run through those. I know Councilman Jensen seemed to have a fairly extensive list. So I don't know if he's reserving them all towards the end or if wants to ask them as we go.
We'll see how many you take care of here.
Okay.
That's my strategy, too. I've got quite a few questions on
Okay.
there as well.
So moving on from general fund onto the enterprise fund side, as council knows, these are our business type accounts. They are intended to be covered in costs by fees for services. So in essence, each one is a business unit, and they are supposed to pay their own way. The council actually has that fiduciary responsibility to make sure that those accounts cover them. Primarily for today, I'm going to be talking about solid waste, garbage, refuse, whatever you want to call it, sanitary sewer, and stormwater. Water does not fall underneath the purview of the City Council. Again, I'll just reiterate that if you try to match up what we're presenting with the budget versus what gets published in the newspaper, that's the difference, is the Water Department gets accounted for on the publications. So with sanitary sewer, we made some pretty significant changes between the first and second draft. A lot of it's related to looking at when is the timing for some of the proposed expenses for the Eco-Industrial Park project. Any changes that we made to health insurance expenses would have been propagated through the personnel side of the enterprise funds, as would pay for performance changes, the reductions that we made in there as well. The biggest thing here that I wanted to throw out for council consideration is that when you look at our different funds, we do not have reserve fund requirements that have been established for the proprietary fund side. The general fund has a 35% reserve requirement. We've never established a similar type of standard on the enterprise fund side. If you look, they're kind of all over the map. Some communities just say we want to keep a dollar amount. Some want to keep a percentage. We've talked about it a lot internally and would like the council to consider establishing a number of months of operating expenses as a reserve. The number that you see on here is in the sanitary sewer, which is the largest of the true enterprise funds. Road use is a quasi-enterprise fund because we don't have control over the income on it. That would mean that our reserve in this one should be anywhere from $1.1 million to $2.2 million. If you say, you know what, 3 months is fine, that's what we want to keep, then this fund should have about $1.1 million sitting in operations. Obviously, it's not projected to end the year at that. This one, in all honesty, has been kind of difficult for us to budget 100% tightly from year to year, just because of the variability of what Cedar Rapids has charged and when we found out those numbers relative to us trying to negotiate our new wastewater treatment agreement. We've had some success with being able to go back. They've proposed a number. We go back and say we don't agree with that, and often at times end up settling, happily most of the time, more closely to ours than to theirs. So if we wanted to do that, if the council was going to establish that, we took a look at what do you have to do with the rate in order to be able to bring the reserves up to that $1 million over a 4-year period. If that was our goal, we would need to increase the base rate just strictly on number of accounts by $1.51 per month. So about $1.50 a month is what it would take to be able to do that. That would bring in about $250,000. That would let us get up to that 3-month reserve. That's about an 8% increase from where we are at right now. It has been several years since we have made any rate adjustments to this one. We've made adjustments to other ones more regularly. Most notably in the last couple of years, we've made some more significant adjustments to the solid waste side, and that's part of that balancing act for council, is that historically we have tried to not hit everybody with every fund or every rate during the same year. We are projected to add cash to the bottom line over and above what we have on the estimated account this year, and in that the second draft would have us ending the year with $263,000 in reserves.
Hey, Lon.
Yeah.
So the operating reserve, is that in case of like an emergency or something?
Yeah, if you have something unanticipated, sewer line collapse, emergency repairs that you run into that needs to be handled. Or in this case, when we move to a flow-based agreement, it's going to be important to have some reserves in there in case you have a bad year, something happens, and we end up having inflow and infiltration running through the system. The other piece, though, is that when you do and Marion hasn't done this a lot, but when you do a revenue bond, they're going to have a reserve requirement that they want to know that you have so much in reserve in the event that for some reason you lose a whole slew of your income. Marion gets lumped together with a lot of communities, but for example, the first community that I was in, we had one user, our largest industry in town, that was about 40% of our income for the sanitary sewer fund. And so we had revenue bonds, and they wanted us to maintain 2 years' worth of payments in reserve in the event that that business closed down. Marion does not have that same level of vulnerability because we don't have that one user that's a huge contributor to our overall bottom line, but as part of doing a revenue bond, they'll still have that reserve requirement. We wouldn't propose that we would need to raise that amount in 1 year because they'll also let us use the sewer replacement fund as towards that reserve requirement, but we do anticipate using that cash and spending it down for projects in the CIP over the next 4 years. So the thought was, let's balance that out, increase the operating reserve at the same time that we're dropping down the replacement reserve to make sure we have adequate dollars to be able to fund that reserve requirement.
So if we did have an emergency and we don't currently have this reserve, we could just use our emergency fund, right?
There are other funds that you could potentially draw it against. The sanitary sewer replacement would be the most likely one, though, that we would use for now. It might mean that you'd have to cancel a particular capital project or something to be able to do that. That's one of the areas where Marion does have a little bit of a leg up on communities. Because we don't have municipally owned lift stations, we also don't have the risks of catastrophic failure at a municipally owned lift station. I can tell you from prior experience, having been through that, you can drop $90,000 into a lift station very, very quickly thanks to a lightning strike. And Marion doesn't have as much exposure, but it's still for us to be able to make sure that we're doing that long-term financial forecasting. If we want to have a reserve requirement and a target in there that we're aiming for, that will really help us frame out that 5-year financial plan that I know council would like to see. On the solid waste side, the solid waste one is in a little better shape depending on what the council would select for the operating reserve. For example, on this one, a 3-month operating reserve would be $575,000. We're projecting to end the fiscal year in 2020 with $550,000 in reserves, so we're fairly close to that number already. We did take a look and said, what happens if council decides that you want to establish on the higher end and go with a 6-month operating reserve? What would that shortfall look like? And to do that, to bring in that additional $500,000 over 4 years, right now is about 89 cents per household. Now, as with sanitary sewer, you do add households every year, so that number tends to decrease as you continue to add accounts. It's not a one-for-one. Everybody that has a solid waste account does not have sanitary sewer and vice versa. It's a little bit of a mishmash. We only pick up fourplexes on down. And so if it's an isolated fourplex, we will pick that up. But if it's fourplexes as part of a condo association where there's 15 of them, those are privately hauled. So this is fourplexes on down and single-family homes. We do have one commercial route established in the Uptown where we centralized garbage collection on the Uptown Artway. But that's our only commercial route that we have in operation now, and that's with a contract. We don't only under extreme circumstances do we use our personnel to go in and pick up anything in that area.
So one thing I think I'll have you think about when we get to these decision points. So one thing I think I'll ask you to think about when we get to these decision points is what is the cumulative impact? What is the cumulative impact of all these pieces that we're talking about? So we talked about $1.51. Here we're talking about 89. We're talking about the franchise fee. We got an increase in our overall levy. So, I don't think we can make a decision, obviously, one by one, but, really what is the total impact on the homeowner?
Yep.
So when we get to the end, I'd like to at least look at it in that manner.
Okay.
These are the maximums, right? I mean, the 89 cents, that's if you wanted the reserve of 1.15.
Yeah, and
We can
again,
stretch it out.
we just picked 4 years. If you wanted to do it over 5, you wanted to do it over 7, you wanted to do it over 10, that number changes. We just wanted to make sure that we were fairly comparing it one to another. And the 4-year on the sanitary sewer was driven by looking at what we would draw down against the sanitary sewer replacement and what we would need to have in reserves to be able to adequately cover the anticipated bonds for the eco-industrial project. On the stormwater side, we're not proposing changing rates on here. We are looking at a slight draw against the fund balance, but looking at that operating reserve number, this account would be considered to be pretty healthy. We're either on the 3-month to the 6-month. 6 months would be a little under $500,000. We're projecting to end the year at about 1.058. Now, we would anticipate using some of that for capital projects in the coming years. But if we have that target in mind, whether it's 245 or whether it's 490, that helps us, again, frame up that financial plan moving forward. Okay. Any questions on that one? Okay. Okay, so here's what the property taxes look like in a more detailed picture from the first draft, or from last year to what's contained in the second draft budget. The first draft of the budget had the property tax rate proposed at $14.36. With all the changes that we've made, the property taxes in the second draft came in at $14.26. The big difference is you've got your normal borrowing for capital projects, but we are also anticipating having the additional borrowing for the fire station. When you've got those type of episodic projects in there that are going to come upon you every 30 years, unfortunately we don't have the ability to use the debt service levy to bank money so that we can have cash to be able to do those types of projects. So your alternative is to take on debt when they occur. And if we were to take that out, that's about a $108,000 swing. The property tax rate would actually be in about the 14-18 range. So from last year to this year, that one special project or unusual project taken out, the property tax rate would actually be reducing. The other thing that I wanted to point out with this one is that, last year the property owner on a $100,000 home would have been paying $791. This budget would have them at $811, so about a $20 increase. I did go back and take a look to see how much of that is driven by just the change in the rollback, because the rollback last year was 55.6%. The rollback this year is 56.9%. Of that $20, $18 is because of the change in rollback, which we have no control over. So as multi-residential continues to get ratcheted down on the amount of property taxes that they are being paid, and as commercial and industrial moved to 90%, and now we're not getting reimbursed for the 90% over and above what the state FY 2017 number was, If residential rollback goes up, it shifts more of the total property tax collection over to the residential side.
Last year you gave us a great education about that rollback, and I think we talked extensively last year's budget meeting, so we didn't touch upon it this year, so talking about what that impact is every year.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is we're projecting in here that we're going to receive backfill from the state. I think Zach has it estimated at about $467,000. But that number is what it will be. As additional commercial and industrial comes online, the difference between the 90% and the 100%, that's just gone. We don't ever get any more backfill from the state on that. That number is just gone. So that's the permanent reduction. That's the long-term impact. But as that number grows, as commercial and industrial grows over time, you'll see some variability on the residential side. It moves it back and forth. If the residential rollback had gone down, we're still asking for the same amount, dollar amount, of property taxes. It would shift back over to one of those other categories. So it's fairly complex. The league projects that the rollback on residential is going to stay relatively steady, a percent and a half up and down over the next couple of years. But after that, you would expect to see that it might actually start to go down again. Don't ask me to explain the linkage between residential rollback and the the value of agricultural ground, because I think there might be 3 people in the entire state that actually understand that formula.
Good screen to ask a question. So this year, or going from draft 1 to draft 2, only 2 of the levy rates changed. One was the transit, which you already discussed. The other one was employee benefit. So really, all of these changes and everything we talked about kind of gets rolled up into the change of employee benefits. So my question is, how is that number determined, the $5,507,000? I have no. Can you kind of tell us where that comes from? Because we made lots and lots of changes, and obviously everything kind of rolls through that one. So how do we really get to that number? Because based on that description, there's a lot of other stuff that changed, but it rolls up into this.
Yeah, the cost of employee benefits, there are certain types of benefits that the city can levy for. Medical insurance, the cost of contributions to a retirement system, disability insurance, unemployment insurance. When we do estimates on a position, the system estimates it based on salary. So that's why when we reduced, for example, pay for performance from 5% to 3%, you would see that impacting those rolled up benefit costs as well. The software takes all of the proposed positions, adds all of that up, calculates out, okay, you've got an IPERS contribution at 9%. You have a municipal police and fire retirement at 25%, and consolidates those all into this number. And that's the cost of providing the mandatory benefits or the negotiated benefits that we have for the staff that are covered. This is only the general fund side. The ones that are in the proprietary funds do pick the cost of those expenses. Any departments that are allocated out, such as the central services, city managers, finance, even part of engineering is allocated out to sanitary sewer. Whatever percentage, say 10% of engineering goes to sanitary sewer picks up 10% of the cost of those benefits as well.
So when we made the changes in our general fund expense, whatever changes we have in employee benefits, we can pass through on this levy. Anything else, we either have to absorb through increased revenue or by using our cash surplus.
Yep.
That's the bottom line.
Or flat out not buying things, not hiring,
right. Reducing
expense reductions.
Expenses,
yep.
Or you get additional revenue, or you dip into your cash surplus, which we're doing some this year.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to, for example, the levy rate right now is proposed at $14.26. Zach did calculate if the goal of the council was to do all in and stay with $14.22, we would need to look at about another $62,000 of adjustments. Steve had asked about what is a penny on the property tax levy amount to. With everything broken out the way that it is right now, it's about $16,303. So overall, the rate change is 0.27% from last year to this year. The original budget, draft one, had the levy rate change at right at 1%. So we've knocked it down by 3/4 between the first and second draft.
How bad has being able to mix the taxes on commercial property and dwellings?
We can isolate it down to individual properties. Marion doesn't have a lot that are classified as mixed right now, where you've seen a change from what Paul is getting at is that properties that have apartments upstairs and commercial on the main floor formerly would have been assessed entirely as commercial properties. With the new multi-residential categories, they now get segregated out. So, for example, the Owen Block building, the former Maid-Right building, the main floor is assessed as commercial, the upper floor is assessed as multi-residential, and so the upper floor, they pay less taxes, and they'll continue to pay less taxes through now in 2024 when that impact is fully phased in. We get the consolidated amount, Paul, of what the total impact is on multi-residential and how much we're losing year over year, but they don't give us the individual properties and whether that's just they combine the number for the mixed-use buildings and the ones that are purely multi-residential like the regular apartment complexes. But if you ever want to see it on an individual building, we can track that through the GIS system. So with the other assumptions that we have in the budget, we do have an additional $1 million in there for franchise fees. I did want to talk about the schedule for that because we got some clarity from that from one of the utility companies. Their rule of thumb, it takes about 6 months from the time the city council finishes the process to adopt franchise fees before they start being collected. So if we launch into negotiating the franchise agreements in March, council takes all the required action in April, we would expect to start collecting the franchise fee in about October. And so there is a delay in there. There are local actions that have to be taken, but then they actually have to submit a document to the Iowa Utilities Board for consideration. The Iowa Utilities Board has to sign off on that, and it sounds like it's a little unpredictable for how long it can take them to be able to render that decision back. But as a rule of thumb, they said figure 6 months from the time at which all the stuff is done locally before you start collecting them. And I know I had noted in the budget memo that a lot of the proposed positions and everything were really contingent on when we would actually start collecting money from that. We do have some cushion in the general fund, but I think it would be more prudent to not budget too much more closely down to the 35% reserve requirement. So we'll talk to the other utilities. I'm not certain, for example, if Lynn REC is subject to having to run through the Iowa Utilities Board like Alliant and Mid-American are. So they may be on a little bit of a different time schedule. As we refine that, we'll find out exactly when that would happen, and we can further advise the council on when we would actually be able to start moving forward with the hiring process on some of the proposed positions. $1 million is a big piece in the budget. One thing I did want to talk about, just so you know a little bit about my thought process on the prior year, I wanted to make sure that because we ended the prior year budget fairly healthy on the general fund reserve side, one of the comments I think was made was about the conservative budgeting practices, which, yes, is absolutely true. But when I put together the budget for the prior year, I knew that franchise fees were going to be an if on whether we got to be able to collect them or not. They were budgeted in the current budget year at $1 million. We had some cushion because we ended the prior year very strong with our general fund reserve requirement. At that time, we didn't know exactly what the schedule was going to be for the new fire station and when we would start to incur those operating costs. So I was very reluctant to budget down past about 39% towards the general fund reserve. This one brings it in about 38.3%, which still gives us a decent cushion for any of those unanticipated things, or if the council said, you know what, even though we know we're not going to be receiving franchise fee dollars until October, let's go ahead and proceed with the civilian evidence tech position. We would have the cushion to be able to do that. You just would need to know that the likelihood is that we're going to end the year closer to that 35% than the original budget would call for. But it does give us a little bit of flexibility. So in the past, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't a case where people felt like we were over budgeting or that there was excessive fat or something in the budget in some accounts hidden here or there. That was done deliberately to make sure that if we didn't implement the franchise fees that we had some cushion, and because we weren't 100% sure on when Fire Station 3 would get constructed and we needed to be able to operate it in the event that we opened it. So the pending changes that we already know we're going to have to do between Budget 2 and Budget 3 is to redistribute workers' compensation and unemployment expenses across the departments. Right now it's just an allowance in the entire general fund, so it's accounted for in the general fund, but we would reflect that in the individual department budgets. And then on the Employee Benefits Fund, there is a planned retirement during the fiscal year, and there's some payout of accumulated leave that has to be done with that, and so that would be budgeted for in the Equipment Replacement Fund. And as I said, here's where the budget calendar comes into play. When we finalize the draft budget, it gets handed from budget over to finance, and the finance department then puts it into the state budget forms, which spits out the form that has to be put into the publication. That would have to be to the Marion Times by Friday for us to be able to meet the publication requirement for the Times. Our backup plan, we can use the Cedar Rapids Gazette as an alternative because they do publish daily, but what we would do there is we would publish it in the Gazette, still publish it in the Times, but the one in the Times would not be far enough from the public hearing date to meet the legal requirement, but it would still provide notification to the public through the newspaper of general circulation. The law says you have to publish it in a newspaper of general circulation in the community, and either one fits the bill, but the Marion Times being our official paper, that's the one that we always look to first. Then we would have the final budget would be included in the council packet for March 5th with the public hearing on March 7th. As I've iterated to the council before, once that public hearing notice is put in, you are not allowed to increase expenditures. You can't increase expenditures, you can't increase the property tax rate. You can reduce, but that's the only action you can take. Oddly enough, there's nothing to prevent you from adopting the budget on March 7th and scheduling a public hearing for April to amend the newly adopted budget and do either one of those two, but procedurally, once that publication is put in the paper, that's your absolute max for what you can spend or what you can do for taxing authority. And then that would give us enough time to hold the public hearing. If there were any final changes or final adjustments that were made to the budget in the wake of doing the public hearing, then we could still have it into the state on March 15th. That is why we have typically not tried to go past March 7th or March 8th for holding the public hearing. In the event that there's any adjustments that still need to be made, we need a little bit of time to get those into our system and get them into the state budget forms before it actually goes on to the state.
Obviously, we're not taking action today. It's not on the agenda, but will you be looking for consensus on items to get direction from us then today?
Yep. Thank you for the segue. There are several decision points for the City Council, and a lot of them have an impact on the bottom line for the budget, and what guidance you would give us today are what we would use to frame up that third and final draft and get the publication in the paper. The biggest thing, obviously, is the positions in the general fund and what the City Council's feelings are related to that. That, in turn, has a potential impact on the property tax levy. If you add a position, it could impact the property tax levy either through the emergency levy or through the employee benefits levy. If you take one out, same thing, they will still affect those levy rates. So we need time to get that into the software. We've got a couple of ideas in there for proposed utility rate increases, and then we have the pay for performance cap in at 3%. We are not offering early retirement in this budget. I do not anticipate offering early retirement in the budget the year after that. Beyond that, we'll take a look at what our current demographics of the city are and see if there could be a potential benefit to the city for looking at early retirement. But it's not going to be something that's going to be offered annually or even every other year. It's going to have to be something that would potentially make sense for us to be able to do that.
Are we not discussing the franchise fee at 3%?
That
as a
is
decision point?
Yes, because as if you recall, one of the things that we talked about was whether or not, if the council decided you wanted to move forward with public safety positions, doing something different with the franchise fee was an alternative. So with that, it's up to you for where you would want to start, which one of these you would want to handle first, but I would suggest talking about the positions in the general fund because those are the ones that have an impact on these other pieces, and with some guidance from the council, we could kind of know where we were going to head with that. So I'll head back to that slide. So thoughts? Was there anything that you had questions on that I didn't cover through the course of the presentation as well? Because if those might prove instructive to other council members. Question, Paul?
When you talk about the,
Well, no, this is based by year.
thing I prefer to call it, there's,
Fire dates.
at some point in time,
Oh, these two.
we're gonna have to annex that area out there. And some point in time, we're gonna have to have water and sewer to baseball out there, which we have none now. They cannot drink the water out of that tower, nor can the people who work in the dump or the county. And so we're gonna have to have water there. Well, I noticed funding when I saw that on the landfill. Are we charging them anything currently for dumping benzene in our sewer system? They should be paying something that could back up in your basement tomorrow morning. And I just think it's time that we get rough with them. I think it's time we figure out how we're going to get water and sewer out to Prospect Meadows, which is, we're banking pretty heavy on. And you got baseball kids that are going to be thirsty. We're going to have water of some kind. I look at maybe a couple $1 million to run that out there. How are we going to do that?
Yeah, we've taken a look at what it would take to get water and sewer out there, and I think the rough estimate is about $3 million. It can be done. It can be served with gravity sewer. In all honesty, it's not something we're excited about. because if you think back to the map of the community, if we put water and sewer out there, it's going to encourage additional development and sprawl. And that's not something we're really equipped to be able to handle right now. We're already expecting to have an increase in calls out to Prospect Meadows just because of the concentration of people that you have there. If you start adding service stations or additional commercial on top of that, you're going to see more of that out there. The way our ordinances are set up, it's either their responsibility or someone else's responsibility, whether it's a convenience store or whatever it would be, to pay for extending that water and sewer out there. We can look at the area that's going to be served by the line that they install and then levy a fee against people or organizations that connect to that in the future. Then we collect those dollars and pay them back to the organization that paid for the initial installation. It's something that's technically possible right now, but with the expense and the number of users and the fact that it's not going to be a year-round projected use, we didn't think that it made sense. Last thing I think Todd wants to do is extend a bunch of water main out there that's going to be at risk of freezing for 4 months out of the year because of the low volume of usage. We do charge the solid waste agency for the wastewater that they contribute to our system. One of the things that Ryan did when we bought the flow meters several years ago was to segregate off their flow from the rest of the community so that we had really good numbers about what they were actually contributing. I know we've looked several times into the benzene issue out there, and when we've contacted the DNR, we've been told that they're within regulated limits and that we didn't have the ability to potentially surcharge related to that. We know we're going to have to annex. We've held off on doing the annexation because Prospect Meadows, part of their financing is coming from USDA, and they don't qualify for that if they're in the city limits. So once they move from the construction phase, construction financing, to permanent financing and close their permanent loan, at that point we'd be able to proceed with annexation at the council's leisure.
Yeah, we discussed it all with the county about maybe them running water and sewer out there and getting their money back on connection fees.
We've talked about it. Again, it's not something that we're 100% excited about, just because when you look at growth and development, it will follow those lines, which is okay on the compact side. But when you start talking about what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to, if there's going to be development and growth that's going to be spurred by Prospect Meadows, we want it at the corner of 13 and 151 or at Tower Terrace and 13 before it starts occurring at County Home and 13. So there'll be a period of time there where not having water and sewer out there works to our benefit from that. I can say that there's a couple of potential projects that have been looking around the community at that 13 Tower Terrace intersection, and they would be required to put water and sewer out at least that far. If they get it that far, it makes it a lot more feasible to bring it out to Prospect Meadows. Tom, or Mike, your departments have been more involved with those discussions than mine. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that conversation, or if you think I covered it.
Just one other thing to keep in mind that we're doing currently is doing a study to determine if our existing sewer has capacity. When you start adding additional facilities out there, our sewers might not be able to handle that extra capacity that Prospect Meadows is giving us. And so that's what we're doing a study on right now to find out.
You may have to go to septic system of some kind out there.
They may have to, or we might have to go in and spend millions of dollars upgrading our existing system to get it big enough to handle those flows.
Their plan was always actually to put septic in to be able to serve the facility initially until such time as we would be able to come out and then they could connect to gravity sewer. Unfortunately, they made a little bit of a tactical error by doing the grading as early as they did. You're not allowed to, apparently, to put a septic field in ground that has been disturbed within a year. So when they did their grading to get the ball fields in, they disturbed the ground and now they have to wait. They have even looked at whether or not there's a possibility that they could secure some land next to them to be able to put a system in for that would buy them, kind of what I'd call an intermediate term service ability.
But if suddenly we had a motel or a restaurant wanting to build out there, we would want those in the city.
Yeah, that's where, again, we'd really like to push that growth and development down to the Tower Terrace and 13 intersection rather than having it show up on County Home Road. I know that you're not their biggest fan, but as long as the solid waste agency is in operation out there, they're not going to be considered the most hospitable of neighbors for somebody that wants to build a hospitality-based business out there. So I think there will be more opportunities closer into the city to see that kind of development, at least initially. Long term, you're absolutely correct. When we've talked about annexation out in that area, we've been looking at not only annexing the south side of County Home Road, but potentially annexing properties on the north side of County Home Road so that everything out there at that whole intersection is under the jurisdiction of the city.
Yeah, but we've had discussions in the past that the further out we run that sewer, then developers are going to be developing along those lines using the cheaper farmland and possibly in areas that we may not prefer.
Yeah.
So I think it's still incumbent upon the city and the city council to somewhat control the manner in how that is done so that we are letting developers know where we feel it's allowable or recommended for them to develop.
Yeah, Albernette and Elko Hill Road is kind of our textbook example of that happening. You know, you just reached a point where developers were not wanting to pay the prices for closer in-ground, so they moved out to property that was less expensive, but it really starts to stretch our serviceability and response times. But you've already got sewer out there, you've got water out there serving some of the other facilities, and you can easily or more affordably serve the areas to the west, and so we've started to see growth out there. We would expect that as Linmar moves forward with some of their school plans, that will drive growth and development in a little bit more compact manner. Particularly the school that they're looking at out near 44th and 35th Avenue. They do tend to be attractors for growth and development around them, and that will help us start to fill out that area for the neighborhood in Indian Creek. So were there questions that you had from notes from reviews of the draft budget that we didn't address during the presentation you wanted to cover?
I have a lot.
Okay.
Mayor says, I got a whole page here. I do. So some of them may have already looked at some of these other comments. So if we go into, let's start with capital projects on 111, page 111. And again, if you just walk through, again, that one there compared to draft one has some very, very large dollar changes. So if you could start walking us through the top one on page 111, starting with the additional bond proceeds of $3,000,004, and go on down to, I've got about 10 or 11 circled. So you can answer a lot of questions real quick there.
Mm-hmm. Second to get there.
While Lon's looking, I did most of this budget, so I guess I will start by, off the top of my head, some of the major changes I know I made.
Fine.
First off, we did ask the staff to go through the big list of capital improvement projects and actually put in by quarter what they were expecting to spend and when.
Okay.
So when I initially budgeted the CIP, I had budgeted to the CIP document. And then we had departments do that, and so then I redid the entire budget. Major changes that I saw, one big one would be the sanitary sewer, Indian Creek sanitary sewer. We only had budgeted Marion's portion of that project, but we are the keeper of one of the segments. And so it went from, I don't know, Mike, do you remember what the number was?
I don't remember the exact number, but Marion's responsible for 33% of it but we have to front all of that. So again, that's one of those where we are the sponsors of the project. We build it all, and then we send a bill to Robbins, Hiawatha, Cedar Rapids to reimburse us. So now it's actually cash flowing correctly rather than just showing the only 33% that we have to originally pay. And that's like a $7 million project.
That project I have plugged in at $6.584 million.
Another major thing that I did, I was looking at the way we were accounting for the eco-industrial park project. With the road use component being a major contributor to that project, rather than accounting for the eco-industrial facility out of road use, we're accounting for it out of capital projects. So I moved the eco-industrial park projects, which would include the de-icer terminal, the public service facility, and the fueling facility, which was 1.3 million, moved those to the capital projects budget.
Okay, so what line item did that change?
That one I added in road use. So I created a 301, 210, 6750.
60, yeah, that went up 3.4 million there.
So that was a portion of it.
Oh, so that would match up with the 3.4 of additional bond proceeds up above.
Correct.
So that's eco?
Yes.
Eco, okay. Got it?
Those were probably the major changes. The rest were a lot of just adjusting projects up or down.
Well, I disagree. So under line 4400, 01, federal grants / contributions general, that went down 8.6 million.
Okay, so again, we were looking at the trails projects, and a bulk of the trails projects were accounted for in the current fiscal year according to the CIP. When I went and met with Kesha, she was saying, hey, we'd only actually be spending this $530,000 for this project and so forth. And I do have a listing that I can provide. But when you do that, because those are reimbursement grants, that then makes the dollar amount coming in that much smaller.
So you're saying those funds will come in the current fiscal year?
So you're saying it decreased, correct?
It decreased.
So I took the amount that we're actually going to spend and multiplied it by the percentage of what we would get back, because those are a match grant. So we pay it up front, and then they give us money back.
So they won't refund money that we haven't spent yet.
Okay.
These are actually very complicated. You at this point, when we do these budgets, I have to look at each project individually and make sure I have all of the inflows and outflows accounted for.
Yeah, and that makes it extremely difficult for us to look at this budget and have any idea how the CIP connects to this budget. I do not have that connection. Is there a way in the future with this software that we can do that?
Actually, the next stage would be to amend the CIP to match this for the coming budget year. When we come back to the council and we make changes to the CIP and start going back through reprioritization, these would be reflected and expressed into the CIP. So for example, if you look at a trail project, one of the things that can happen is you might end up you're doing your estimates on when you think you're going to need the money up to 18 months in advance. If you end up having to go to condemnation with a property owner, that can push those expenses back for a year. And then you're only going to be looking at bringing in what you need for the costs of the condemnation and the land acquisition. So there are things like that, especially when we're dealing with those federal programs, that can cause those very significant swings in it. But as we refine that process, Steve, absolutely, we want to look at ways that we can make sure that those link and make it easier for people to follow. Because the capital projects funds in here is supposed to be an expression of what you have for the current year projects in the CIP.
Right. So we had a discussion at one point in time, is there going to be a possibility where we have these capital projects of showing the detail, a line item for trails, a line item for 7th Avenue for the Central Corridor, a line item for whatever we're working on? Are we ever going to be able to see those line items within these funds?
Let's say part of the issue that you're running into there is that's not how we're required to report them. So I have to do what state requires, but then you're trying to add in layering. So long term, what we'd really like to get to is project accounting. There's a module so that we could print a report off of that would show the budget. I've had zero time to work on that.
Okay, so that's...
because we're always working in these Excel spreadsheets outside of the software.
So we still need to put in our project accounting
Yes.
software.
And that is also one of the major reasons why I was asking for that accountant position, because I'm the one that's doing this now. and I don't have that much time to put into it.
Yeah, we talk about these capital projects, maybe one at a time at a city council meeting, but we're in a phase now where we're going to be having so many large ones going on that I don't think that's as needed, as up to date as we're going to be looking for, and that we've been talking about wanting to have at least in some manner,
Sure.
even if it's quarterly.
But yeah, you do also have the complexity of sanitary sewer projects need to be accounted for in the sanitary sewer fund. Storm sewer projects needed to be accounted for in the storm sewer fund. So
Okay, so on here
it's a bear.
then, on line 444001, local grants contributions, that was increased by 4.4 million,
And that was the contributions from the other parties to the sanitary sewer
plus sanitary sewer.
project.
Okay, talked about that one. And that's trails there. Okay. Traffic, 67 to 50, increased 525,000. 6750.
Sure. I'm just looking. I'm pretty sure that was one when we added a traffic signal
Traffic signal.
project. 525,000 was for the Highway 13 Hennessy Parkway intersection.
Okay.
And there should also be a $500,000 TSIP grant that offsets that. Steve, if it's helpful, I can make this look a little bit prettier and print it off for you. It actually does have the account number for each expense item.
And a lot of my questions going
For
through,
all of
there were
you.
so many big numbers that changed in new bonds being issued, project capital outlay, capital projects increasing by significant numbers. And I understand, I think it's good to have last year's projects brought up to date and then this year's rolled in, but there's a lot of changes that went from draft one to draft two.
Yep. And this draft of the budget also does reflect the YMCA's full remaining contribution, including that additional 800,000.
So we talked about, I know one of the big changes was on the eco project and then the equipment from that. Are those dates, as you planned this into our budget, did all those dates kind of slide out from what you originally had put into draft one?
Yeah, there's.
How much?
Oh, far enough that we ended up only having to account relief for one payment during the course of the fiscal year. I mean, I think Ryan was thinking it's probably around 3 months that the project has moved. Am I correct, Ryan? For the building, about 3 months behind where we had originally anticipated to be.
No, it's about right. What's your question, I guess? What's your specific question?
Well, I know there were a lot of changes in bond payments and interest payments, both related to the eco project as well as the CNG equipment. So I saw a lot of changes in there, not only in the funding and the timing of it, but also the principal and interest payments were all changing quite a bit from draft one.
So if you reference the capital improvement project spreadsheet, if you look under the facility, that was spaced over a few years. So we were going to do a bond issuance in fiscal year 19, fiscal year 20, then potentially fiscal year 21. But now what we're looking at is bonding probably in one bond in September, just because it's going to be cleaner and easier.
Okay.
That's what changed. The expense of the project has not changed. It's when the bonds would be issued. That's what changed. So if you take that project sheet with the CIP on it, it'll match perfectly with what's in the budget now.
Okay.
Yep.
I was going to say, and as for the debt service on that, I had talked to Lon about, Ryan had originally budgeted for principal and interest payments, and we typically do interest only in year one in most of our things. And when we had talked a lot about how the CNG fleet is supposed to give us some operating savings, I thought it made sense to delay paying principal for a year, just like we do with our GO bond issuances, to make that first year lighter.
Yeah, that'll be a big change. Okay, then one more, so that answered a bunch of them. But over in Lost, on page 157, we are moving money from Lost, this is in the stormwater, but we're moving another $1 million from Lost over to stormwater. What project exactly was that?
That would be regional stormwater basin, I believe. Is that the one out off Echo Hill, Mike?
Yep.
That's that one? Okay.
Yeah, those are about the only thing that we spend out of stormwater that gets to those amounts.
So a lot of the changes are just truing up the budget to what you've all put your heads together for what is now happening with the CIP.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Maybe one more. We had the subdivision major streets increasing 300,000, taking money from the Economic Development Infrastructure Fund. Could you kind of just tell us what's going on there and why we're doing that?
Yeah,
That's unusual.
those are based on, we work with developers a lot, and they tell us what their schedule looks like for doing a project, and if it's one where we have a share of that project, we will try to budget for it appropriately. I think with this one, it's a case where the developers told us that they are not going to proceed with that project, so then we're not going to need the dollars in the current fiscal year.
Is that, you said we partner with them, is that like for?
That's where, if we have to pay over width, over depth, over sizing, yep. Which specific project was that, Mike? I know Darren.
I know for the stormwater, we didn't, so for a stormwater oversizing, we only pay if it's a major or collector street and if it's over 36 inch. And with all the subdivisions that we have, there's nothing on the map that would make those terms. So we just knew in the next year that we wouldn't have payments in that.
Okay. I'm done for now.
Okay.
I just have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one is in franchise fees, and maybe you've talked about this before, but can you just share with us again how that compares to what other cities, comparable cities, are doing with franchise fees?
Sure. In our area, Cedar Rapids has franchise fees in place. I know it's something that CenterPoint has looked at. They've passed the authorizing legislation, but I don't know if they've actually started to levy a fee for it. Cedar Rapids has them at 3% and has for I think at least 5 or 6 years. They use them to fund public safety positions. As part of the franchise fee, you have to pass a revenue purpose statement, which means you're declaring to the public what you're going to use those revenues for. It's very typical for communities to use those for expenses related to public safety. Then it has to language has to be inserted into the franchise agreements to allow for the fees to be collected, and then they are collected on electric bills and natural gas bills. It's not, if the council elects to do a 3% franchise fee, it's not a 3% increase because right now everybody is paying local option sales tax on those bills, and so the first penny replaces the local option sales tax. So it's only the second and third penny are the ones that would actually be a new net change for the bill payer. It does mean that tax-exempt organizations do pay franchise fees where they do not pay property taxes, so there is a little bit of a shift there. But then it also is one that people can influence by the amount of power or natural gas that they consume within reason, knowing that you can't eliminate those expenses altogether. It's one of the few revenue sources outside of property taxes on the 810 levy that the council does have discretion on how you spend. But once you pass the revenue purpose statement, the revenue purpose statement governs what those funds are used for. Des Moines has them, I think, at 5%. A lot of the larger municipalities do. One of the nice things about the franchise fees, versus property taxes. With property taxes, we're always 2 years behind. So we have a need for services based off of a population that's here today, but anything that's been built doesn't pay property taxes for 2 years. With franchise fees, as soon as they turn on gas and electric, those fees do start to come in. Even from the last time that I looked at those to now, the estimates from Alliant have gone up about $11,000 per penny over the last year for how much would be collected.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
And then you had shifted quite a few of the start dates for the positions that you had proposed. Can you just walk us through how you made those decisions to shift those dates?
Yeah, we tried to take a look at what's the most critical need for the departments, but also when are you going to be able to do the hiring processes and do the onboarding so that we're not necessarily overburdening everybody with a whole bunch of positions starting at the same time. There is a compromise for that. I don't generally like to do that because you're saving cash in the current year, but you're going to realize the full cost of those positions in the following year. So it's not something that we try to rely too heavily on. In some cases, when you've got, like in the case of the fire station, where it'll be opening and you know what that date is likely to be, you can tie hiring to when you have room for the personnel. If we hired them on July 1, we simply wouldn't have room for people in the existing complement of facilities. So that'll drive some of it as well. But like with the ones for the evidence tech, that's proposed as a July 1 hire. When we look at the police department right now, we know that they are down several personnel because of whether it's injuries or whether it's recent departures. So that one makes sense because it gives you somebody who's available immediately as soon as that civilian evidence tech is hired. And then you just start to stagger them out after that.
Okay. And then just one more question. And this is, I'm not sure how best that you're going to answer it, but as I'm thinking about the levy, right, and then the franchise fees, and so just thinking about the total cost to a average citizen, I can't get my mind around that, and I think that would be really helpful if there's a way that you can articulate so I can understand it. I bet if you can articulate that for me, everybody else will get it then at that point.
Well, there's a couple of decision points that will drive that. One is the reserve requirements that we're proposing for the utility accounts. If we were to add up everything that's proposed right now for a typical user of sanitary sewer and somebody who owns a $100,000 house, you're looking at $55 during the course of the year. The cost of the franchise fee is something that is really highly personalized to each individual user. If I find it, hang on a second. I'd run an estimate on this a while ago if I can track it down.
All of them? Not just this. That's 20. But the franchise.
I'm trying to track it down. I had actually gone through and on my house had taken a year's worth of bills to see what the franchise fee would do. So I'm trying to track that sheet down. It's been a while since I had it.
And that $55 is including, and I know that's going to fluctuate based on decisions we make, but that includes those additional fees attached to stormwater, right? Solid waste and sanitary sewer, rather, excuse me. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, assuming that we were trying to hit those reserve targets over a 4-year period on each one.
Sure, thank you.
Oh, shoot. I don't think I can access the drive that's on from this computer. Sorry, I'll have to track that down.
So it doesn't include the franchise fee, that $55 a year?
No, that does not include franchise fee.
So, okay,
That's these two. Utility
Right.
increases plus the levy is 55.
and then franchise fee on top of that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's $55 for 100,000, per 100,000 valuation.
It's $20, approximately $20 per 100,000 evaluation. So 300,000 evaluation, 60. Mm-hmm. The other ones don't scale up according to or according to value. I'll have to track that down. Sorry, I don't think I can access the drive that it's on from this computer. So what we're needing input from the council on is those different pieces. Primarily, whether you want to break them out individually and talk about them fund by fund, that's at least a picture, that 55, of what someone who has a house that's valued at $100,000 would look like. Now keep in mind that's taxable value. That's a $100,000 house, so the taxable value would be basically considered to be $56,000 on that house in the current budget, up a little bit from the prior year. So as Steve iterated, you do scale that according to the actual value of an individual home. As the other pieces, the utility rate increases, when we're looking at those, the big drivers for those are wanting to make sure that we are adequately funding the reserves in those two, between solid waste and sanitary sewer. Stormwater is going to be fine. Urban forest utility, we're not proposing a change for this year. Stormwater, we're not proposing a change this year. So we have two proposed fee changes out there, and then where the council wants to end on the property tax rate, because that influences the other discussion. The franchise fees, I know that the council wants to, that we're having some discussions about that, but that last year that was something that was authorized to move forward. So if you want to revisit that, it hasn't been implemented, so that's certainly your prerogative to do so. But we've proceeded as though that was a decision that council made last year that we were going to move forward with.
Did we talk about a revenue purpose for that a year ago?
Mm-hmm.
That was for
Public safety expenses.
safety?
Yep.
So my questions are a little more general before I think I'm on here. Yeah, thanks. And I missed the first budget meeting, so if this is redundant, let me know and I'll try to have a one-on-one. But I guess my first question is, so I'm not a finance person. This is like heavy-duty Snoresville stuff. Sorry, Steve. Would we ever consider doing a zero-based budget and building up with what we need, as opposed to continuing? Like, when I was looking through these page by page, for example, on page 64, road use, I look at the description of road use, and then I look at the purpose, the sources of revenue, and the expenditures, and it just doesn't make sense to me how road use pays for finance / city clerk and city manager office departments, a portion of it. major sources of revenue are road use taxes, which, I mean, it just seems like if you think about those words, road use tax, how are our expenditures, some of these expenditures? And there are many accounts like this where things are just back and forth, and again, I'm still sticking on this road use. I'm looking at the actual 2016-17 at 61,000 and change, to the budgeted last year of $395,000. Like, it's just exponentially jumping. And then it's requested for 2019 to 2020, it's another exponential $4 million from the year before, which was $400,000. And I just have a hard time wrapping my head around this money trail in all of these different accounts and things coming out of this one and going into this one. And that might be a normal thing. And so, I apologize if it is, because this isn't my wheelhouse. But I mean, can you just walk me through road use a little bit and tell me how this makes sense?
Sure. The utility funds pay for a percentage of all the support services that they need to have in order to be able to function as a utility. I mean, if you think of it in terms of, say, Rockwell Collins, or Collins Aerospace now, has a government division and a commercial division, but they don't have separate HR for each one. So HR would get allocated out a portion of it to commercial and a portion of it to governmental business. We do the same thing with our component business units. So the component business units each pay for a portion of my salary, they pay for a portion of finance. It's all done in lieu of having to have those and bear 100% of the costs of having those functions internally. If we didn't have a centralized accounting staff and New World software system, the road use fund would have to pay for all of those services 100% on their own. And so you'd look at the balance of staff. It makes more sense to take advantage of economies of scale and to allocate those costs out across the different funds. Now, that's one of the areas we are going to be diving more into this year, is because the formulas that we used on those allocations, we looked at it back in about 2010, and they need to be trued up again to make sure that they are really reflective of what those costs actually are. So we do salaries and benefits as a percentage, but for example, we don't do a percentage of the cost of City Hall as a building or anything like that it takes to operate those departments. We don't allocate a portion of the paper that the finance department pays to the road use fund. So there are pieces like that will change over time. The road use amount had been set and was actually fairly low, but that was because in 2010, that was the year before we started getting our new allocations, and road use was in danger of running into the red. So it was run a little bit light. We have made an adjustment to bring it up to the level that the other utility funds are paying for those services as well. So that's the rationale behind doing that. With road use, the other thing that you're seeing in there is that we have deliberately not been replacing fleet. We've not been making huge investments into the facilities, knowing that the eco-industrial park and the new public services facility building were coming projects. So the de-icer facility would get paid for, and so we've been holding down expenses for things that normally would have been being paid for out of that account to kind of build up some of that money to be able to do that more in one fell swoop. It's a little unusual. We don't have the capacity to do that in all of our funds. Road use is really unique in the fact that we don't have control over the receipts. We only have control over the expenditures, and it does have some fairly tight limitations on what you can actually use those dollars for.
So that accounts for the big jump in expenditures.
Mm-hmm.
And then the difference between transfers out and expenditures is what?
Transfers out are just a flat amount that's done to transfer to another fund for operating support. So while we don't do a percentage allocation, we do a flat transfer over to the general fund for some of those operating expenses. That's part of, though, what we need to do to make sure that we're basing that on a formula and scientifically allocating out those numbers rather than just selecting an amount.
So is there a place where you can just see all of, like, and maybe it was the beginning of the budget and I had some stuff there too, but just salaries and benefits by department, and where it's not paid out of different levies and taxes and blah, blah, blah. Like where you can just actually see what that number is. Is that in this document? Because it's hard to, like I was trying to put together, it's like a puzzle, and I mean,
Hang on.
I would expect to, seriously, I went through this 171 pages, and I started highlighting things and trying to track it, and I thought, oh my God, this is way beyond what I'm able to do, and so, it's hard to intelligently think about some of this stuff because I don't even know that I understand it all because there's just like a gajillion buckets of things.
Hang on. If I can get this to show.
Same part of the support for the first position. Yeah.
Yeah.
Buckets are getting more and more.
So one of the things we would be able to provide is this is something that Amal had put together, taking a look at the actual, what I think what you're getting at, Renee, is the costs of departments. This would be the earnings by department. This I'd have to see what this is drawing from. I think she's probably got a spreadsheet developed that this draws from to create the exhibit so that you'd be able to see that. But this is essentially what our payroll expense looks like across the organization, broken down by different categories. So, for example, the dark blue here at the top would be the building department. So in 2010 it was 4%, in 2018 it's about 4% of total payroll. But this would have to draw from raw dollars for you to be able to see what those accounts come up to.
Well, and wouldn't it make sense to put building and planning together? Like just to lump those because of the, I don't know what the right term, reorg or consolidation that happened last year. So there was a little bit of that confusion for me. And I don't know. So back to the zero-based budgeting. Any chance of that?
We actually, when we switched to the new software, that's where we started. Everybody rebuilt their budget from the ground up when we switched over to New World. And that's one of the things that actually makes it difficult to compare pre-New World budgets to new ones, is that we created a lot of new line items. We moved expenses into more appropriate line items to provide better clarity on where we are actually spending the money. But that was something that we did at that point, was go back through and reconstruct every budget from the bottom up. As it stands right now, the departments submit their budgets, and then when we went back through them, especially when we went back through the second iteration and started to look for doing about 600,000 in reductions, that's when we started to really kind of forensically look at each and every line item coming through there. There are certain things that we don't have control over. The police department the station's going to cost a certain amount to heat. There's not much that we can do about those on the fixed expense side. A lot of the other ones in the general fund are driven by the complement of personnel, and then, as council knows, we've been discussing other ways to be able to control that. We really pay a lot of attention to that health insurance side because it is such a big driver on the property tax piece. It's $5 million plus of the total property tax asking that's associated with that, largely driven by claims and how we're doing. Our well-being program has paid significant dividends to us on that, and right now is responsible for about a 10% reduction from where we would have expected to be in claims if we didn't have that program in place. So I don't know that I can say that we do scientific zero-based budgeting every year, but we do start with expectations and provide guidance to the departments on what we're looking at for utility rate increases if they're 2% or 3%, what we're looking at for other increases like vehicle operating supplies, gas, diesel, things like that, and then the departments are responsible for building their budget from that point forward.
So in the memo, you had mentioned that departments made cuts. Did you have an edict of everybody cut 10% or everybody do your best? Like, what's the equity in terms of what was asked to be done and what came back?
We went back through and we looked at all the departments to see where there were potential areas for savings. We focused a lot on some of the larger departments and especially ones that did have significant increases proposed from year over year to see if there were areas that we could potentially trim that. Zach went back and took a look at the individual history of a lot of line items and asked for clarification from many departments on spots where they could potentially be trimmed, and we asked all departments to go back and take a look at their budgets and see where they would have areas that they could true up to be able to reduce those numbers overall. I don't know that, I'm not sure what your meaning would be when you would use the term equity. I look at where are our major expense drivers, what are the things that we can do to be able to control those expenses. Especially with something like this, we looked a lot at one-time expenses. Things were proposed for acquisitions through the course of the year to make sure that we could still maintain our fundamental operations. We gave up a lot of things in here that I would consider to be things that could enhance those operations. For example, one of the things that was proposed from the city clerk's office was going to an online codification system. That was taken out of the budget. We took out the dashboarding software, knowing that a lot of the council really likes dashboards and it'd give us the capability of doing that to the public. But we focused more on making sure that we could keep our core operations in place and gave up a lot of the things that would have been considered enhancements or one-time expenses.
And then, so I want to drill down on education, just that topic, because it was like under every department and then certain departments had like other, I don't know how to describe it, like, oh my gosh. And I don't want to, like, so police, but then there's K-9 unit, or like parks, but then there's rec. So again, there were a lot of pieces to look at, but can you distinguish between an education stipend and tuition reimbursement?
Sure. Tuition reimbursement is something that's considered on a case-by-case basis for whether or not an employee is going to go for an enhanced degree. And we take a look at those individually to see, is that something where you're going to be bringing additional value to the organization? Is there going to be a return on our investment to do that? Those are governed and we look at them individually. The education stipend is generally awarded to an individual that has a master's degree. In very few cases do we have job descriptions that actually require that. So they had set up a policy years ago that those who had education in excess of the requirements received a flat annual stipend.
On top of salary, just every year, if you have a degree, you just keep getting cash for that?
And in some cases, it's governed by certifications. For example, a building inspector, as they would acquire additional certifications, there's a cost to maintain that certification, and the city would help with the cost of keeping those certifications current.
So we would pay to send someone to school, and then when they get degrees, we then reward them for that as well. Do we have any teeth in the contracts with people to, like, what if someone earned a certain degree and then left 6 months later? Do you have any way of getting anything back or getting that investment?
That is not something that the state of Iowa nor the court system are particularly fond of. There are communities that have gotten themselves in trouble for trying, for example, to put something like that in place with police officers, because it costs $12,000 to send somebody to the academy. And the last thing you want to do is train somebody and then have them leave 7 months later and go somewhere else. And it's something that has not historically been supported for us to be able to do that.
I would disagree
that we
to a
couldn't,
point,
but,
right.
yep.
We did that on the school board because there's a tuition reimbursement and that kind of thing, and so we put something in place to kind of protect ourselves a little bit there. Hang on, I might have had What is meant by allowances? There's a line item for allowances, and that was all over the board in different departments. What
There are
falls
different,
under that?
yeah, there are different pieces that show up underneath allowances. Departments for that require uniforms, for example, may receive a uniform allowance, and then the employee gets that allowance, and then they purchase different items for their uniforms throughout the course of the year. It's also used and can be used as the allowance section for individuals that might receive a vehicle allowance in lieu of being assigned a vehicle.
Okay. I did see a separate line item for uniform, though, in certain departments.
That's when we've got a uniform service where it might be something where we provide it and we have a contract with a company to provide uniforms.
Okay. And then how are training and conferences handled? Is that, if you're in a department, can you go to anything you want? Is there a certain order of you have to alternate years so different employees have the opportunity to do these things? Is it, if it's justifiable with your line of work, anybody can go? Or how do we regulate those expenses?
The departments generally will put together a training plan for that and take a look at what is needed and what for example, let me pick on the planning department. If you have an EICP, they may have a continuing education requirement. If you have a CPA, there's going to be a requirement for the number of hours that you have in order to be able to maintain that. So there are certain conferences that you can attend that will be able to allow for that. We budget for them according to professional development needs. So for example, my contract stipulates that the city sponsors my membership to ICMA, and also then I have the ability to attend the ICMA conference. As part of maintaining my credential, I have to get 40 hours of continuing training every year. Usually I can get anywhere between 18 and 24 with that one conference. There are departments that will look at their staff, and I think, like, for example, on the Parks and Recreation side, Mike takes a look at the recreation staff and may alternate the state conference year to year depending on who's going to go. If it's local, like say if it's in Cedar Rapids and you don't have to stand the housing expense, they may send both based on the registration. But we do review that. We take a look at the training that's proposed. We have to balance it out according to what people need, if they've got licensure or anything that they need to maintain. But it's not as though anybody just has ultimate discretion to be able to go to whatever they want. There are departments that in the past have just allowed their employee to have a certain allowance and said, here's the amount that you can use for training throughout the year, but you have to make then a proposal to me for what conferences you would be able to like to attend, knowing that you have X amount of dollars to be able to spend.
So do we have a policy that's consistent by department on expenses related to, there's like professional fees, there's subscriptions, there's dues, there's conferences, there's tuition, there's ed. You know, some of it I've talked about, some other things fall under there, and they total up to be quite a bit when you look across departments. And I'm not suggesting, especially being in the field of education, being a former education, I totally get it, and I do think we need people to do this, but I just want to make sure it's regulated and equitable in such a way. And I'll give an example. And we got an email, I think everybody did, about the Medco luncheon coming up in March, and it said something like, you know, RSVP, and it'll come out of your department budgets. But I just wondered, is that quantified? How many people from every department can go? I mean, I don't know how many people are interested or need to go or want to go, but do we have the reins on these kinds of activities and this whole thing in general, so that it's not just a big pot and whoever wants to go can go? And I don't know, I was just a little taken aback by that, and it made me wonder how loose some of these other mechanisms are.
Yeah, the departments, when they submit their training budgets, provide transaction level data. So it's actually tied back to individuals or a number of individuals that that they're proposing to be able to attend a certain event. So for example, I do the training budget for the legislative budget, which is the city council. So when I take a look at that, I'll budget a certain number of council members to be able to attend the National League of Cities, or a certain number of council members to be able to go to the annual chamber dinner or the Medco luncheon, but it's always tied back to the number for how many people would be allowed to go. The larger departments would often stagger that to where if they're proposing to do 7 and they have 21 employees, somebody might get to go once every 3 years. It just depends on the total complement of the employees and then whether or not they're doing work or activity that's associated with a particular task. I would say that, there has been an expectation that the city shows up to support those partner organizations. So for those local ones where the registration fee is relatively inexpensive compared to the major conferences, we have allowed some discretion on departments for how many they want to be able to attend. We do allow it to also that if they want to make a trade-off throughout the course of the year, if they budget for 7 people to go to Medco, but they want to send 10, what's the trade-off? What are you not going to do, or what training is going to be taken out to allow for that to happen?
Okay, I just wanted to make sure there was intention and policy and equity in those things because, like I said, there are just so many different lines and departments are broken up, and looking at the totals in some cases for tuition or ed, I don't remember which one it was, the number just would jump exponentially from one year to the next, and so it made me wonder if there was a consistent budget for that or how those were looked at.
There are some things that crop up once in a while that will drive those costs. For example, several years ago, there was a change to the paramedic requirements, and so we had a couple of people in the fire department that had to go to supplemental training that was fairly expensive in order to be able to be trained to the new standards. So you can sometimes see some variability according to that, but you also then have departments, and police and fire are two of the major ones, where there's just an expectation. They have high internal standards for what they're going to do for training, and in some cases driven by what they need to do to maintain their various credentials.
Okay, thank you. That'll be it for me for now, but in case anybody else wants to go.
I will jump on. Thank you. I just had a few things as follow-up, just to kind of dive into your bullet points here, Lon, if I could. Chief Crable, we've been talking about these firefighters coming on. You thought the construction would start in May. When is our completion and Station 3 going online, actually? May of 2020. Okay. I misunderstood. And construction is to start in May of 2019? Is that what you just said? Okay. Going back to the fire as well here, so we would be delaying the hiring of 3 firefighters. Would those only be the 3 firefighters that would be considered rookies and on probation then with the opening of Station 3, or would we have additional? But it would only be these 3, is that correct? Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we do have some estimates in the personnel line item to allow for the creation of the battalion chief positions, and assuming that those are going to come from within existing staff, then we'd hire new to replace those.
Right, okay. I just want to make sure I hit all the fire here that I had questions about, so I have that. Couple questions. This is going to be referenced to your bullet point on the pay for performance. When did we establish the pay for performance structure, Lon?
The original pay for performance, I think, was 1994.
Okay, and when was the, if you want to call it the amended version, or I'm thinking it was just a few years ago.
The change to eliminate the COLA, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that might be what I'm looking for.
That was I think 2010. I'd have to go back and look for sure.
2010? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We had been talking, and I think last year it was brought up that there was going to be a compensation study done citywide. Could you touch base where we're with that, and I guess when it's going to be done, how it's being funded, and what's its derivative of looking for there would be, if you can elaborate.
Sure. It's in the capital projects plan, the capital improvement plan, and we are anticipating funding that, I believe, out of interest that is earned on the balance in the capital projects fund. We've got a draft, I think, now of the RFP to select an organization to do that. We do the RFP process, make our selection. I think the early ones that Jen had talked to were proposing about a year for that study to be completed and to be completely done. There's several different pieces of it that we're looking for. One is to take a look not only at what compensation looks like by position, but really look at what people are doing and make sure that we're actually comparing like duties to like duties. We don't want to get caught in a trap of, and I'll pick on the PD for a little bit. Prior to Chief McHale arriving, we had a position that was called captain. But if you looked at what our expectations were of the captain's position, it really was the expectations of a deputy chief. And so if you had tried to compare duties, if you just compared job titles, you would have been doing an incorrect comparison. So we want the consultant to actually go in, take a look at what people are expected to do, and compare those to people in other organizations, both public and private sector, that are expected to perform those similar duties. We want them to look at our total compensation package, what types of compensation we offer, and provide us some guidance on what other types of compensation are out there in the market that may be similarly effective but aren't based necessarily on a standing adjustment to the base wage. I think there's one other component that we were talking about having with it. Oh, classification. Making sure that we have some internal parity across the organization as well, because even if you look across the organization, you might have similar titles and similar duties in different departments, but because of the way that they were compared in the past, there could be a wild variation in what they're being paid internally, even though the jobs are comparable. So we want to be able to correct for that as well. And depending on the RFP, some of those other pieces are going to be more critical than others, and I think we'll have the flexibility to say this is the piece we want you to deliver first before the other pieces come forward.
Having heard that discussion for quite some time, when do you think, I guess I'm a little disappointed we haven't moved a little quicker with this process, because I had asked you last week about discussing this, which is what I'm going to bring up next. When do you think we will see something where we have some start to this, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
I'd like to have the RFP out in March, but absolutely no later than April, so we can get that moving.
Of this current year?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Obviously, we know payroll is a huge component to this whole thing, and as I have been studying this schedule, I am not in favor of this. I know there's been a lot of discussion. I guess I'm just going to be the one to kind of start this conversation.
Say what that is.
Yes, I'm sorry. This is correct me if I'm wrong, this is the city's current pay scale by category or job title. Yep. is what it is. So this is the document I'm looking at. Thank you. And you've alluded to it as well. You've already brought it up, and that's some of these things, a lot of these key components where we've got, positions at either a maximum or a hard cap on a 20-year comparable would actually earn less by taking a promotion into a next level of supervisor or advisory position. With my background as well too, this is as Steve is with taxes or budgets, this is my key area here. I'm just concerned with where we're at, where the current pay structures have been. I know that this is a drastic reduction going from the 5% down to the 3.5. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I'm actually even in favor of doing a wage freeze with the exception of a cost of living increase until we got our hands wrapped around this. Just again, this is just my opinion here. But I think some of these, we've consistently banged out 4% and 5% increases year over year over year. I think some of these are high. I think some of these are low. I just feel like we're really not even. I don't even know where we're at on the highway on this thing, in my opinion. By doing that, that would help, I guess, take that biggest component, that slide that you had up there as far as what payroll dollars were over each one of these departments. When we take a look at a percentage, again, it goes back to the 1% or the 1 cent levy tax is equivalent to $16,000. There's a percentage factor to this on the payroll side. And again, just as you mentioned, it's a derivative of workman's comp, unemployment taxes, pension plans, everything is a derivative of that. So I just want to throw that out there as my opinion, where I feel strongly about this. But I wanted to kind of bring that up at this particular point. I knew we were on track with doing a study on that, and I just think it would make a great time for us to pause for a period of time until we got our hands wrapped around that, in my opinion. I'll give you a moment to comment on that if you would like before I move on.
Yeah, the original pay-for-performance system did have a COLA component to it, but you had COLA that was layered together with pay-for-performance. And so you'd see years where the cost of living adjustment could be 3.4%, and then you still had pay-for-performance on top of that. Under the original system, those two had a maximum of 6% that could be earned in the course of a year. But the original 3% or whatever the COLA was set as part of the budget, and it was automatic. And that was generally conferred. I mean, that was just no further discussion on that other piece, and the pay for performance was brought back later. The one thing that I'll say is the wage freeze can only apply to non-represented positions, because anybody that's in a bargaining unit has a contract, and we are bound to abide by those contracts, and that's more than half the workforce. So, I mean, you're talking about half of the employees being able to get a raise, which is budgeted for all of them, I think, around 2.85%, and everybody else not. In addition, the thing with the bargaining units is that one of the things that often gets lost in that conversation is you talk about percentages. Well, the percentage is applied to steps in the contract. So if you get a step in the contract and the percentage, you're actually getting a higher amount than that. The pay-for-performance system was geared to be able to try to maintain some of that wage separation that you're talking about. Now, one thing I will say is that the policy on promotions does provide the opportunity to make sure that somebody going from one position to another does see a base increase. So if you move from one position to another, there's a minimum of 5% increase that is required for you to go from one position to the next. The other piece is that, and this is something we actually have changed recently, is that in pay for performance, when you went from one position to another, like say you were promoted from a pay for performance position in PD to another one, there was actually a policy there that you kind of started over, so that you went in and you were only eligible for 2.5%, and then you were eligible for another 2.5% over a period of, I think, a year and a half after that. The problem with that, so it didn't give anybody any credit for their accomplishment of the goals that they had before they took the promotion, nor did it give them any opportunity to work and achieve the goals that were sitting there that were the expectation of the position. New hires coming in under the pay for performance system were the same way. 6 months was 2.5%, then a year after that was 2.5%, and another year after that was another 2.5%. So there were some pieces that were put in there to help control some of that wage escalation that you're concerned about. If you want to do COLA, I have no philosophical opposition to that. I just would want to know when we want to measure it and how that would be done. I think when we applied it to the council, for example, in October of last year, it was around 2.2%. But, you know, this is a budgetary issue. You're getting into some of the policy implications related to it. It would just mean what we would need to do going forward. Conversely, you could, as a council, just say we'll still do pay for performance, but we want to limit it to 2.5% instead of the 3% that's proposed. That's within your discretion as well.
So I got a question related follow-up. So when you talked about the 2.2%, was that the percentage, and I think Zach and I had this brief discussion a couple weeks ago, but is that the Midwest wage index percentage or close to that? I mean, how'd you come up with the 2.2%? So is that an index?
It was specified in the council wage ordinance. It's one of the CPI indexes.
So the CPI index?
That's published quarterly, and
Okay.
it was the fall one, yeah.
And that was 2.2%. So if we compare that to the 3%, in essence, that allows, and the one thing I do like, based upon what you talked about earlier, is that each department will have a pool of money. And it's up to that department manager then to determine how to allocate that. I do like that philosophy. But, you know, the 3's close to the 2.2, so.
In this particular case here, though, 0.8 is a big difference in a payroll.
How much?
Well, it depends on what your salary is.
How much of a difference would that make?
I did some estimates on the PFP based upon some of the FY19 salaries, and what I found is that, because one of the questions you had is what's the increase in point and every half a percentage increment, and I saw it's about $37,000 on the general fund.
Okay.
For each and change.
Half
It's
percent
almost
is 37,000.
about 38,000, correct. At the current wages FY19. Now, mind you, each year they change, and because it gets a little complex to do the numbers out because our current pay for performance doesn't match the fiscal year, meaning we don't start on 7/1 with the increase. We do the increases typically on 4/1. So it's a timing of when you take your numbers. But that's the general fund side. The total all fund side would be about 47,000. That would take into account some of the proprietary funds per half percentage increase.
Just to be clear, I mean, whatever the percentage is, whether it's 3 or 5 or whatever, it's not across the board to everyone who's eligible. That's just the maximum.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that everyone's getting that, is it? Or has that been the case?
No, it's not something that's been applied exclusively across the board where it's just treated as a blanket amount that everybody receives. There's still performance goals that people have to achieve,
Okay.
And you have to go through an evaluation process.
So if it's 3%, there are people that are going to get less than 3%, and the top is the 3%.
Yeah, to iterate a little bit more on what Councilman Jensen was talking about, the amounts in the past had always been applied to an individual, and so each individual was eligible up to a certain amount. What we're treating it as now is a pool per department. So if you do have somebody who you want to make the case for, we're budgeting at 3%, that this is your pool of available dollars to do pay for performance. You as a department head could have the discretion to give somebody 3 1/4, knowing then, though, that means if that person's taking this much bigger a piece of the pie has to shrink elsewhere within the organization. I like that because rather than having it budgeted on an individual basis where it's per employee or just individualized to that person, going to that pool means that the department really has to be accountable for how those dollars are going to be allocated. And so it's going to really force the issue of saying, well, you know, the star performer is here. If the star performer is here, everybody else should be relative to that.
Can I just have one more question before Randy moves to another topic? Do you mind?
No, go ahead.
Could you, and excuse my ignorance, but how is the wage study, how is that a capital project? You said it's in the capital improvements plan.
Capital projects, capital
Or
improvement plan.
capital projects, yeah. How is that a capital project?
I think it's estimated at $100,000. So it's anything that we went over, I think, $25,000 for our floor, we figured should be accounted for as a capital project rather than be something that we should try to assume that variability out of operating funds. And what we're using to fund it is the balance in the capital projects fund does earn interest, and so we're using the interest earned in the capital projects fund balance to pay for that.
Okay, right.
Just in general here, and I'm sorry, I don't want to belabor this, but just in general, out of all these line items that we have here, other than the bargaining units, how many of these are salaried versus hourly?
Everything on that list should be a salaried position, I believe. Is that correct, Jen?
The reason I bring that up is because there's a lot of areas where overtimed hourly employees are making more than the salaried employees at higher supervisor levels. So, for example, if I want to be a library assistant and I cap out at $50,336, this is where I'm thinking, is we ought to have tiers within these departments. If I want to make more, I should apply and work to get to the next level. Library assistant 2, now forgive my ignorance, I don't know if this requires more supervisory level, it's almost the same dollar. It's actually a decrease in salaried at that level in that position, is the way I'm reading it. That's why I feel that there should be more structure, and it sounds like you're moving towards that. If you're going to give a department their money, they can structure that however they want. But if I want to be a paramedic 1 and I want to go to a paramedic 2, I want to apply and work towards that level to make that more to make that higher income,
Yeah, and
rather than relying on a flat increase that's absorbed from a citywide level. Because I think everybody, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I can only imagine what some of these pay for performances look like. Everybody's doing a great job. They're overworked. They're underpaid. Everybody looks the same in theory. So there may be some structure, constructive education to be, from a performance standpoint, everybody, I would imagine, probably running a really tight middle of the road.
Yeah, when the way that the wage bands are really a consequence of the way that the calculations are done based on policy. And if you think about the variability for the width of the band, that's going to be driven a lot by the center point. So historically, we've gone out, we've taken a look at comparable positions across organizations like mine, for example, and we determine, okay, what's the midpoint of our comparable group that's being paid for that position. You go X number of percentage below that, X number of percentage above that, and that's your range. The difficulty that you're talking about is that 20%, whether it's 20% below and 25% above on my number, is a broad range compared to an entry-level administrative clerk. And so tends to be some overlap between those. We do handle that at the policy level by making sure that somebody that's going to be promoted from one to another does have a minimum amount that they are expected to, that they're going to get by taking that promotion. Where you do run into trouble is some of those ones where you're moving from an overtime covered classification to a new one. But in general, a lot of those are also going to be positions where there might be some other pieces associated with it. So like if you're moving from, say, a patrol officer into a different division, you might go from having to bid shifts and being on 3 shifts to being 8 to 5 during the week. So there are other trade-offs that come into consideration on some of those promotions as well, beyond just the straight dollar amount. I think people look at those and have to determine, is this right for my family situation as well, along with, am I going to be earning some additional income? That's the struggle with it, and honestly, one of the I think from my perspective, the hardest things to deal with is that, in many ways, the floor sets what you end up having to do for those promotional positions, and we don't have much control over the floor other than what can be done through the collective bargaining process.
So you're saying there's some lateral movement that's not being reflected on this by assuring them that they will have adequate increase from pay scale or from job title to pay scale, correct?
There's a minimum of 5% that you would get if you go from one position to another that are pay for performance positions. So there's a minimum amount of 5% that you would get on a promotion. Even if you're at the top of one range and the bottom of the next range is below that, there's always going to be a minimum of an increase.
Okay. I knew I'd get some backlash from the library, so go ahead, Holly.
Not backlash at all. 100% agree. 100% agree. There's absolutely no difference in my book between a library assistant and a library specialist, and we are doing that work right now at the library. So I 100% agree with you, and we plan to do exactly what you're asking us to do and level that out before it's all said and done.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry if I took so much time on that. It sounds like there's departments that are already working on this. So I just wanted to express my opinions on that because, let's face it, payroll's a big part of every budget. So.
And yeah, I agree with Randy that this wage study should have a very high priority in this next several months because, again, we've all had lots of discussions on compensation. Obviously, it's the biggest line item, as Randy talked about. So I think there's always a high level of interest to make sure it's fair and equitable but reasonable based upon what we need to do to respond back to our citizens.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that, new compensation methods, things that are done differently in the private sector that I think we can look at that can be instructive. It's just, the way the system is set up, local governments in Iowa tend to compare to other local governments in Iowa, but that really doesn't take into account the fact that we do have a local market and that there are positions that have analogs in the private sector as well that we can take a look at. They've just moved on and been more creative typically than local government has, and I think this presents an opportunity for us to take a look at some of those pieces and see what makes sense for us.
And I know there's current reviews right now being done, so that what we're talking about is for next year's budget, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I just want to make sure I had the timeline correct. I'll turn it over to someone else. Thank you.
What are the decision points?
Okay, let's get back to the decision points. The big one really, it springs from, everything springs from the property tax rate, what the city council is comfortable with the property tax rate, and what you want us to do between the first and the second, or the second and the third draft budget. As it stands right now, last year we were at 1422. The proposed budget in draft 2 is at 1426. That's a $62,008 difference between those two pieces. Whether or not you would want to take a look at using the emergency levy could have an impact on that. We just need some instructions and guidance from council on where you want to end on that piece. I know with the utility rate increases, that's a budgetary convention, and the thing that I'll remind the council on a lot of that, once you set the property tax rate, that is what it's going to be. When it's published and goes in the paper, the only thing you can do is take it backwards, but that goes in. Utility rate increases affect the budget, but the council still has to take additional legislative action to implement those. That is not something that just happens automatically. If we budget at an additional 90 cents a month on the solid waste bill, you as the council still have to pass the ordinance that makes that happen. So, what we would do is we would go look at that, we'd put together the ordinance, we'd come back to the council with a timeline for when that could be done. You still have discretion, though, on when those rate changes happen. Luckily we're not in a situation for this coming budget year where we have utilities that are projected to continue to draw against fund balance to where their financial position is projected to get worse over the course of the year. They're all either staying pat or moving positive, with the exception of stormwater, and that's only about a $10,000 decrease on one that already has a good fund balance in it to begin with. So just because it's projected in the budget does not presume that it's automatic. The biggest one out there is that franchise fee. It has the biggest impact on the general fund budget and really drives a lot of the decisions that are going to be made. If we take the franchise fee revenue out, that's a $1 million hit to the budget. And then not only are we not moving forward with the positions that are proposed in the budget, we're talking about going back to that budget and looking at having to reduce headcount. To your point, Steve, the last time I looked at it, the cost of personnel in the general fund was about 60% of total general fund expenses. And with some of the other pieces that have been moved over, it's probably higher than that in the current proposed budget.
I'll give you some of my high-level comments. First, I look at the rate of last year of 1422. We had added the emergency levy of 9 cents, which we never did use for the backfill. So I really look at this from my standpoint of we're going from 1413 up to 1426. Second, I'm not a fan of using the emergency levy. Last year we had to do it because that situation came in at the end.
Was 1422 with the emergency levy?
Yes.
Last year, yes.
That included it, okay.
Yep.
Included it. And we never used it.
That wasn't what we ended up with.
Well, that's what we charged.
Mm-hmm.
What did we actually end up assessing? Was it at the 1422?
Yes.
Yeah. So. And I guess the other piece is if we talk about the franchise fee, I know we talked about that in the past. I don't recall all the conversation. But, I mean, that's kind of an across the board. But, if that brings in some additional revenue, we can use that for some some of the public safety that we're talking about, I'm okay with that, but I'm really not in favor of adding to this overall levy rate.
Mhm.
Well, 1426. We're at 1426 now. So anyway, that's my general high-level comments.
Can you go back to the decision point slide, please?
Sure.
1426.
So we need to talk about whether we are amenable to those or not, but I don't see the franchise fee bullet up there or the operating reserve budget. Both of those should also be bullets that we need to discuss as potential revenue sources, correct?
Those are options that, yes, would be there for the council. In large part, they're driven by these decisions that you make. So I didn't leave those on there as a specific decision point. The franchise fee was one that I had talked about as an alternative to look at that. Again, that was a decision point last year, and council at that time did make a decision and tell us to proceed with doing the 3% franchise fee. If it hadn't been for the fact that we had such trouble finding an attorney to do it, we would have implemented that and moved it forward by now. We'd have a timeline now and a process that we would move through over the next couple of months to be bringing those pieces back to the council to get that done. But if you want to, I mean, that's your call on whether you want to put that in place.
I just want to, in one place, see every potential increase that we are considering enacting or not.
Mhm.
Is there anything else other than those two that I missed that we talked about?
No.
Okay.
What is the
Well, there
franchise
are-
fee going towards? Is it going towards these positions? Specifically these positions?
Without the franchise fee, we can't move forward with those positions. It would be income that's receipted into the general fund and would give us the ability to fund those positions.
So these positions plus other.
Yeah, what we'd be looking at is that the franchise fee, when you set it aside for public safety expenses, it gets receipted into the general fund, and then you track it through the general fund. But as I said, we do know that we're going to have next year we're going to realize the full cost of those last round of firefighters for the entire year, and we're going to have the operating cost of Fire Station 3 that's going to be hitting the budget.
Yeah, but we can't say it's going to fund all of these positions, because not all of these positions
No.
are public safety.
Right.
So it'll apply to the police, fire, and that'd be it.
Communications, yep.
Yeah, communications,
Yep.
right.
The only one on that list that we would not be funding expected to fund out of that revenue source would be that accounting position.
Was what?
The accountant position, yep.
Equipment operator? We can't fund an equipment operator.
Equipment operator's proprietary fund. That's
Okay, yeah.
that's road use, so yeah.
Right.
It's
so
got
like
its
that.
own dedicated source.
Right.
So
And parks.
so to be clear, the $3 franchise fee,
3%.
3%, sorry. I have $3 written down, which is why I said it that way. That gets us most of these positions, nothing additional that has been discussed, correct?
Lon, going back to the property tax levy, so when we have projects that are out there, such as the one that was approved last week, and we talk about, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going to be experiencing tax levy increases in the future years, where are we capturing and where are we paying attention to those that were promised in the past and what year they're going to be coming on as we move forward? So we're talking about this for next year, but what's going to automatically backfill on obligations that we had previously set before?
Yeah, if you recall back to the discussions with the CIP, we gave the council data on what it would look like, what it would take on the property tax levy to be able to fund those projects based on a 3% growth rate. And so we gave you numbers based on, okay, this is what it looks like in the first year, this is what it looks like in 5 years, this is what it looks like over the life of the CIP to be able to fund these projects. Sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head what those numbers were, but that was all based on an anticipated 3% growth rate based on our average trend over the last 10 years. So years like this year where we had a 5.4% 5.7% increase, that number actually goes down. But those are all contemplated and get brought forward to council for decisions in the CIP. That's one of the things I've been trying to kind of keep separate here is that, you have the obligations under the CIP, but then we also have the obligations under the operating budget. Everything that I've talked about in here related to any fee changes is related to operating budget expenses. The discussion about utility rates or anything like that for capital projects was part of what we talked about with the CIP discussion itself.
Okay, because I know, obviously we're going to have some major increases coming up in the future, obviously, on those.
When does our first TIF die?
We have quite a few that have actually gone off the books. You mean as far as a district expiring or a project?
Before we start getting some.
They tend to roll off over time. So one's, I think Finance has put together a schedule that shows a lot of those, and we could show you when they would be expected to roll off of the books.
And that's going to make a difference in the.
Yeah, there is a very indirect impact to the general fund side when we do tax increment financing. That's why we try to be pretty prudent about the number that we're using and keep it fairly stable from year to year and not assume too much on the TIF side because it does reduce the income coming to the general fund. If you think about it, if our property tax rate is $14.22, then we're on $100,000, we're basically getting, $14,000 worth of income. When you do tax increment financing, you get the whole $100,000. So it's that trade-off between losing a little bit to the general fund but being able to tap into the larger amount for bigger projects.
What concerns me on that, Lon, is as we talked yesterday a little bit, and maybe you can clarify this and take some of the scare tactic away from me that I have with this, and that is when some of this TIF money is coming back. So, for example, you're already, in your mind, spending 50% of the tax money coming back from the economic development area for the runway project. It concerns me a little bit about how we're leveraging things for other projects rather than bring that tax back in, which I think if it was me sitting on the council at the time, I would think there would always be a callback at some point in the future when we're going to start getting that money back, but yet we're leveraging it on other new projects. And I understand the process, but can you, like Mr. Draper says, we got a lot of TIF money sitting out there, and we're not, on a conservative side, reallocating that back into this. So when will the nutrition process on that?
It's part of the zero-based budget.
Right.
Well, with that, for example, in the Collins, there's two districts that we have that are unique. One is the Collins Road Extension District, the oldest and largest one. That one is unique because it was created before the law changed in 1995, so that district does not have a statutory end date. The Central Corridor TIF District has a slum and blight finding on it, which also gives it a longer period of time that district can exist. But there are other ones, like the Winslow Road TIF District, for example, that when the Winslow Road TIF hits, I think, 2021, it's done. Anything created after 1995, if it's not a blight elimination district, has a statutory end date on its life. So if you have a deal that you did in the 20-year window in year 16 and you did it for 10 years, you can honor that obligation for the 10 years. But you can't do anything else new in the district, and anything else that's already expired within that district, once it's done, it's done. That is one of the reasons why when we bring forward projects to the City Council, you'll notice that we do not, in only very rare circumstances do we ever propose to the City Council that we do a 100% rebate on tax increment financing. It's because we want to make sure that there is an immediate benefit to the bottom line for being able to proceed forward with projects. If you look at other communities in Iowa, even ones in our metro area, there are places that you can go and you just know that you're going to get X number of percentage for X number of years, no questions asked, because it's this type of project and you check off the boxes. We do a much more robust review, and we really are tailoring it to, if we didn't help with this project, would it proceed at all? And trying to make sure that we're right-sizing our incentives to the amount that's needed for that project to be able to proceed. There are other public purposes for why you might tap into the revenue from a broader district to be able to pay for some improvements related to that. But again, we try to be fairly prudent with it, knowing that there is a bit of a penalty to the general fund, and that we don't want to end up with, say, 40% of our valuation going towards TIF, because we'd be crippling ourselves on the general fund side. It's always a balance with that. When you go back and do things like we're contemplating with the airport, what you want to be able to do there is to be able to use that revenue for a specified period of time, make the improvements, knowing that that's one of the pieces that will allow development to continue to the east of the airport, that it lets the community continue to grow. I can give you an example of communities across Iowa that have used tax increment financing to pay for swimming pools. That would be, I don't think you would ever see us propose to do something like that in Marion. Even the case that you're talking about, you had asked a question related to the YMCA and Recreation Center. If you look at the preliminary plat that was proposed for the area around the YMCA, there are additional commercial lots that are being created to the west of the YMCA. So when I talk about it being an economic development driver, there's an immediate tangible impact from that project coming in and actually getting Gills to do something with one of the prime pieces of commercial property along the Tower Terrace Road corridor. So there are limited circumstances where you would look at doing that type of financing for a project.
Do you think, though, those monies could have been more, I don't want to say appropriate, but do you think that there would have been other opportunities, though, to spend that money on projects that would have maybe secured the landing of that business on Tower Terrace Road rather than apply it to this project?
I can't say 100% for sure that would never have happened, no. We have done one incentive on a project out there, two. We did one for ESCO, and then we just approved the new style of one for the multi-tenant retail center going out there with the intent of targeting a specific type of business to come in. So when you have ones that are taxable, you can be very specific about where you're going to draw the taxes from to do that and what the incentive will actually be.
And that was my only concern, because I know, in a nonprofit organization, and I understand, I don't want to belabor this, it's just, obviously we want to try to keep rolling dollars, in my opinion, rolling dollars in investment vehicles that bring back those investment dollars and just kind of keeps, it's a nutrition. That's what I work with on a daily basis. I would like to jump to the topic of the 2 police officers. I'm in favor of, you brought this up in one of the other slides. We had a couple council members that had brought up that they were adamant about not changing the tax levy, as I will jump on that bandwagon as well too. You brought up the PD on there and the major cutbacks that department has endured to possibly take a look at this, not encompassing that altogether, but I guess where I'm going to stand on this is I'm going to bring it up for the discussion for council about bringing in those 2 officers. Mr. Draper said it before, you're very good at finding money, Lon. I'm not in favor of making any more cuts to the PD, so I'll start that conversation.
I can tell you I've already got one call. And I don't know where people get their info. How could you vote to give the YMCA $800,000? But we need police officers, and they're going to protect 40,000 people instead of serving 10,000 people. And I've already got that call, and that won't be the first.
Yeah, one of the most difficult things about city government is that it is easier to fund capital projects than it is to fund positions. When you look at the constraints, think about it in these terms. The debt service levy is unlimited. There is no statutory cap to that number. You can levy on the debt service levy whatever it takes to service the debt that you've undertaken. The general services levy, the only one that can be spent on everything, has a statutory cap of $8.10. that hasn't been increased since before I got into this business 25 years ago. And so there's this expectation that somehow or another you're just going to continue to be able to operate underneath that number, and then it's going to be sufficient to fund governmental operations. That's one of the struggles that we have whenever we're putting when we're putting operations together. And I want to be very clear, you know, the police department did do a great job. They really dug into the proposals that they had for this year, but their ask from the budget year over year was $573,000 more. So they reduced $125,000 from an additional $573,000 ask. So you're still talking about a significant increase in that department from year over year. A lot of it is out of their control. They have nothing to do with what's budgeted for the union positions. They can't control health care costs. They can't control retirement costs. So some of those things just have to be funded year over year. The only way you can affect that number is by changing the number of personnel that you have in the department. So yes, they did do a significant amount of work. They were really great to work with going through this process, but we are still looking at a significant increase in that budget even with that reduction.
I just want to expand on that a little bbit, and I don't know if this is a question for you, Lon, or if it's over to you, Chief, but we talked about, Lon, you had shown it was $107,000 for new hires. I'm going to go back to this podium of saying I would like to see a way for us to attract and recruit so we don't have the schooling. Is that possible? And tell me, somebody please explain to me why we don't do that. Because in the private sector, if you're getting somebody that meets those qualifications, they've done that training, we've already got them set up, they are feet on the street. We don't have that learning curve, that education training that puts us in there. I'm looking at this pay scale and I'm thinking, why can't we throw them in there? Here's their pay, here's your gun, here's your car, we're good to go. Just please, from an ignorant standpoint, please explain that to me.
The position that we just posted with the resignation a couple weeks ago, this was actually the first posting where we explicitly noted that we would take certifications, Iowa Law Enforcement Agency certifications. So we're hoping to attract those individuals that have the certifications, and when they do come to the table, I anticipate if I identify one of those individuals for hire, I anticipate walking down to City Hall, having a conversation with the city manager on where I could start that individual on a salary basis based on the experience that they are bringing to the table at that time. I don't think we have a civil service issue there because they've already come. They would have to test for us through the civil service process. The thing that when they go through that process is they bring the certification. Then we're not expending the money that we have to send them to the academy. And as you say, we get them immediately. It'll be an abbreviated FTO program we could put them through. But I think in brief conversations that I've had with our union, the person would start with no seniority, which I would completely agree with if I was in their spot. But maybe 1 to 5 year or a 5 to 10 year period, we would have to have a conversation with the city manager on what that salary looks like bringing them in the door. And my very brief conversations with the union, they didn't have much heartburn with bringing them in at a little bit higher salary, but the seniority was a non-starter.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And again, I think that goes back to this scale that I'm having a hard time understanding for our application. In line, you say, 107,000, 27,000, send them to the academy and so forth. Totally get it. That's where I'd rather go out and search for that talent and bring them back because as an employer myself, I know what it's like to run the ad, do the hiring, do the training, and you might have some second thoughts, through that process. Had you been able to go out there and recruit and train from that level, it just puts everybody in I call it the fast-paced mode. So I was just curious on that. So thank you for that clarification, and I'll let someone else talk.
That's something that I think, as we've looked at it, just the struggle has been is where do you expect somebody to come in? If you expect somebody who's already been a patrol officer for another organization for 3 or 4 years to start over and potentially take a pay cut to come to our organization, they're going to be pretty reluctant to do that. The other thing that in Marion's case is a little bit unique is I do think there's probably a sweet spot there for officers that are earlier in their careers, because if you get to the point where you're vested in IPERS, you're probably not going to want to jump to municipal police and fire and start over. But if you've only got a couple of years in and you're still more towards the starting wage earlier in your career, it's something that I think we can market and look at and be more attractive. I'd be fully supportive of doing what we can to try to bring people in the door where we don't lose them automatically for 12 weeks to get them trained. And then I don't know what the exact statistic is, but if we're at a point where, say, 1 in 5 gets sent off to the academy and gets trained and doesn't make it out of probation, that's a big problem. I'd much rather have somebody that is a known quantity, that you can look at the body of work that they've produced, you know what you're getting when they walk in the door, has some history, and can get out on the street for you faster.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Right, Zach?
So I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to go right on the heels of that. Can we not offer signing bonuses? Because then it's not compounding benefits, IPERS, those kinds of things. So I don't know if that's what you call it, and maybe I'm thinking about sports and great teams. But maybe that's also an incentive, right? To put just a signing bonus, if you will, toward recruitment. I wasn't here for the first budget meeting, but I am for the additional officers. I don't know how we work it out, but I think we got to work it out. I think we need to hasten the compensation study because the largest part of our budget is our people. They're our best resources. There are so many things tied to it. In the year that I've been on council, we've talked about reorganization, the org charts. We've been doing new positions and hiring, promotions, contract negotiations, and so many things hinge on that. And so making sure we get that right as our compass, I think, is crucial. So I just want to underscore what Randy brought up and Steve touched on, and maybe even Paul did. I am not at all in favor of creating any more operating reserve accounts, not for it. I'm okay with the franchise fees, and I don't know what else you need. Oh, and I'm not for raising the levy at all. So I know that's a lot of creative stuff you guys have to do, but I think from me, those are all of the decision points unless there's something else.
I got a question just about the 2 police officer positions we're talking about. How did that number, we have 1 additional police officer net in the budget. That'll give you 1 more additional foot on the ground. So where did the 2 additional number come up? Why isn't it 1? Why is it 2? Maybe I missed a conversation about where that magic number is coming from and why we're talking about 2 additional.
I guess that's something that Joe and I haven't talked about a ton, but in talking with past administration and past officers, if you're going to add, you've got 3 shifts out at the department. If you're going to add officers where you can add 1 per shift and have 3, it makes sense because then you can have an impact on every shift right away. Certainly they have the ability to be able to move folks around and put 5 on one shift or 6 on one shift and be able to maneuver them to different positions based on need, but that's always the rationale that I've looked at, is that rather than, preferably if the budget will support it, rather than doing onesies and twosies, to look at something like that where you're bringing them in together as kind of a cohort.
And that's all been done and figured. Okay. The goal of adding staff over the next 5 years is to remove the supervisory capacity from the shift bids, to where the supervisors can be supervisors and then are answering 911 calls. A year and a half ago, every baseline study that we looked at showed that this department was understaffed by 20%. We are currently operating at a 10% deficit of our current capacity. So that means that we're actually, based on all national standards, we're actually operating 30% below where we should be staffed according to national standards and to a study that was conducted by a very competent university in 2017. In the strategic plan, it is outlined over the next 5 years exactly where each one of those bodies will be placed. In 2019, 2020, for example, they go to the evening shift. The following year, we begin to fully staff the day shift. And then the last one that is able to assume the staffing where we can remove the supervisors from the shift bid is the overnight shift. The same type of tiered staffing is also in the strategic plan, broken down by year based on position, to fully staff the communication center to where we can begin to have professional dispatch, 2-person minimum with supervision in our dispatch center over the next 5 years, so we can begin to professionalize the model, provide supervision, and it's broken down. The law enforcement component and the staffing of where everybody's going to go and the rationale of why they're going to go is under strategic goal 1. And then the public safety communications center, the staffing study, it's all broken down by year in strategic goal 6 for everybody to look at.
I'd like to say, after 30 years of my familiarity with civil service, hired one, probably went through a list of 40.
This last list, we certified a list of 20, and I was able to take 2.
Difficult to hire police officers. You don't have nearly as many testing.
It's not only getting harder, but I want to make sure that the biggest source of liability for any city, in my opinion, is the law enforcement. I don't want to hire, I want to hire the best. And call me critical for being picky, I am going to pick the best. If they qualify for civil service, that's fine. We'll look at them and we'll go by the civil service rules.
I believe your last list of 10 you threw in the wastebasket.
We certified a list of 20. I was able to take 2, and that was through due diligence and looking at all 20 candidates. So we really did our best. With the lateral transfer, we do need to be careful, though, of individuals that are looking to leave law enforcement agencies for reasons that we may not know about. So I will have to make sure that we vet that process, and we get somebody coming to us with a certification. Are they going to come to us with a certain amount of baggage too? So I'll be real cognizant of that also.
But I think the important thing is that, to my knowledge, we've never lost a police officer to another department.
That's something that Deputy Chief Slagle says a lot, and I can tell you, I think that's true, right, Doug?
Yes, sir, that is true.
I love being here. I mean, just going to put that out there.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Now, just to give the council kind of my perspective on some of these issues, I have no issues with adding 2 officers. I have no issues with adding 4 officers, even 6 officers. When we get to that point, I'm going to want to see what kind of results we're seeing from that. Joe has done a good job of outlining things like these are the operational decisions. I want to be able to say, well, what does it mean with supervision? You say you've got to have supervision. We need to be able to articulate that to the public, because if property taxes do have to go up to be able to support those positions in the future, we want to be able to equip you as the council with the knowledge to be able to answer those questions. If you're going to contemplating raising taxes because we're going to put those positions on there, it's our job to be able to provide you with the information that you need to do in order to be able to justify those decisions. The other thing I want to be careful with, though, and I'm going to be very blunt and very direct about this, you as a city council should be very careful that you're not just rewarding the department that has the best lobby or the one that's been in front of you. The police department, I think, has done a good job going through and doing an analysis and putting together a strategic plan and putting together a good plan for how they're going to use that human capital. But I don't want to open the door to have individual departments coming in and starting to lobby the city council directly about what we think our staffing needs are. That's something that's, one, disrespectful of my position, and it puts the council in the position of having to now all of a sudden be the one who has to make those judgments and be responsible for that global view for the overall organization. And that's my job. My job is to bring together to you a budget that looks at all of those different pieces and says, this is the one that is going to best serve the community. It's very easy to get pulled into one or another here or there. But I don't want to encourage that or that to become the new model to where everybody all of a sudden just thinks it's a free-for-all, and whether it's just whether it's a presentation or whether it's starting to go out and have one-on-one conversations with the city council members about what I think I need, that's not a door that we can open. Because if you do, you'll never get a break from all the phone calls. So I just want you to be aware of that and be cognizant of that. As I said, I don't have any issues with what PD has proposed. When we get to 6, I'm going to want to see more data. I have no issues with 2, no issues with 4. If we've got to stagger it in, we've got to make sure it fits the budget. And I don't think the chief would have problems with that either. He expects results from his officers when he puts them on there. He's got a plan. He's going to want to see and make sure that the plan is working, or they're going to retool it.
Lon, I hear what you're saying, and I totally agree with you. I also feel a little sense of frustration on you. I'm just going to be honest with you. And there's also, too, I think that's a two-way street. I'm not a big favor in the airport. That's not a surprise. So for me to sit here and also hear how we're going to, and I know previous councils have made decisions on that airport, and that's great. But I just want to know there's a dual line of respect here as well, too, on those, and appreciate what you said. And I have no problem feeling those phone calls from the general public. They're already starting to roll in, and I know a lot of that's been done and dealt with because of previous council sessions and things that have been put out there on the audio recording. So I just want you to know from my perspective, I hear you loud and clear and appreciate that. But also, too, I know that council has a responsibility to the citizens as well, too. So just want to know that mutual respect goes back and forth, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and there's no, I mean, the plans are the plans. The city council, prior city councils cannot contractually bind you in perpetuity. If you wanted to do something different, I mean, I'm the only city employee that works directly for you. I mean, you're the ones that give me my instructions and marching orders. If we're going down towards a project and you collectively as a council say, you know what, we don't think that's the right idea for the community anymore, you collectively just tell me that and we will switch direction. The vision for the community, everything that I'm trying to implement comes from the city council. It's not my vision for Marion. It's not my ideas for what this community is supposed to be. I'm supposed to be the one who takes what you collectively want the community to be and make that happen.
I think the other impact we need to consider is all of the positions we're talking about only have a partial year included in this year's budget. So the thing to consider is all of these positions we're talking about, next year's budget needs to be able to fund the full year plus all of the benefits. And again, so I'll keep coming back, and everybody knows I'm a huge proponent of a 5-year financial plan, because then we're able to look at what is the impact on the levy with the 5-year CIP plan we have. We can put together a 5-year personnel plan, and now we can all be talking about intelligently what that impact is on adding all these different positions for all departments that you recommend based upon the anticipated growth we're going to have. So my question with all of that, everybody knows how I firmly stand on that. When would you project we will have a 5-year financial plan?
The 5-year financial plan, well, the first piece that we have to do is finish the human capital plan, and that's what we would project for hiring, and then we'll have to tie that back to until we get the compensation study completely done. We'll give you our best estimation of what it would cost to employ those positions. Right. And then that will spring forward into the long-term financial plan. That's one of my goals for this coming year, is to be able to present to the council a 5-year financial forecast, knowing that the first 3 years are going to be better than the last 5 years, and it's just going to be something that we're going to have to continue every year. But take the model where we have a 5-year CIP and start applying that to the long-term financial forecast for the city. One of the other goals is I don't know if I can get if we can collectively get that done and give you a long-term debt management plan, but that'd be another piece that I really want to make significant progress on this year, is to give you the overall picture of how we're going to strategically use debt, when we would be looking at doing debt issuances, with the CIP, that really gives us a big piece of what we need to be able to do and model that going forward. It's ambitious. There'll be a lot associated with it that will need to get done, but I think it's going to be critical for us going forward. Because I have to be totally honest, the way the budget sits right now, if I'm looking at next year, without all of these other moving parts, I would tell you right now, if nothing changes, I'd be proposing a hiring freeze for FY21. Simply because we have fully realized costs for these positions in here, and we have the operating costs for the fire station. Again, once we get the designs on the fire station and they model those forward, if they come in and, we're not expecting them to be gigantic, then we can take a look at some of those. But I think it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for us to have a year where we can stabilize with our current cohort. That's where that delay between needs and income related to property taxes just absolutely kills us, is that our current complement of staff, in my mind, is always 2 years behind the financial resources that you need to support it. And the only way that I could reasonably think you could close that gap would be to just take a year off from adding positions. Now, I can tell you also, though, that there are strategic initiatives that this city council has talked about and things that you'd like us to proceed with that we don't have the expertise to do in-house. That there are pieces out there that we'd either need to hire somebody to do it or we'd have to contract. We talk a lot, for example, about using technology in place of people. Well, we don't have the expertise in-house to fully utilize a lot of that. We've got some of it, and we're going to work through some of those processes, but to really get there, we would need some application support folks in the IT department that could really help starting to build that capacity and build understanding, fully utilize the tools that we already have. So to be able to implement a lot of the stuff that you'd like us to do and move that forward, it's either pay Peter or pay Paul to do it. So some of those decisions will be coming your way as well. So we've heard from Renee on where she's at on the decision points. Does everybody agree with that, or do you have different perspectives? If I recorded it correctly, I think she was okay with the franchise fees, would like to see the 2 officers worked in, and were you wanting I wrote down that you were still looking at $14.22 for the levy rate?
22 or 26?
22, whatever the current, I didn't want to raise.
Oh, you didn't raise it. Oh, flat from the current year?
Yep. I have high expectations, Steve. I have the trust that this staff can get it done. There's a lot of dollars in there, and apparently can be shuffled and moved, and I think it can happen. And then I said I'm not in favor of creating any new operating reserve accounts, like I think we were given a couple of examples of that.
Well, those aren't new operating reserve accounts. Those are just establishing a standard for us to shoot for and how much we should have in our operating reserve accounts.
So they already exist.
Yep.
Okay.
And you're just looking for a policy. We currently don't have a policy. We just
Correct.
have reserves, but there's no policy as to where they should be or where we'd like them to maintain.
There's no target.
To be
There's
maintained.
Yep.
And okay, so what you're asking for is to set a target.
That's the policy decision, at its fundamental core is what should the policy be for what we should maintain in those utility reserves. We had based the numbers, giving you the range for what it would look like at a 3-month operating reserve or a 6-month operating reserve. Let me see if I can find that.
So if you're looking for feedback on that, I'd go with the minimum 3-month, because we still have the emergency reserve that could also be tapped should we need more.
Yeah, I'll follow up on Renee's comment. Again, I am in support of the franchise fee at 3%. I would support the utility rate adjustments, but not bringing it in over a 4-year period of time, bringing it in over a longer period of time, which is maybe what you just talked about, is maybe making that 8 years, because we haven't really had an issue or concern with that. So we're already tapping the citizens for a number of items once we throw the franchise fee out there. So by stretching that out, I think it shrinks that down. So if we stretch that out, instead of 4 years, 6 to 8, I don't know what the magic number is, but you could still you could accomplish it on a higher scale, but just bring it in over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and I do think, from my perspective, that is a critical piece of information for doing the 5-year financial forecasts, because otherwise that reserve can be all over the place. But if we have a target that we know that we're working towards, doing that 5-year financial plan, we can aim towards that target. I guess, from my standpoint, if we can change the time on how long we expect it's going to take to get to that.
Yeah, okay, so let me follow up my other, so I did also previously, I was okay with the 1426, because I know a lot of changes have been made. We're talking about making some key changes, bringing in one more police officer, adding the fire station, and doing some things. So I think I can certainly justify, the 4-cent increase. And if we can add 2 police officers without increasing that, I will certainly support that. But otherwise, I think we need to look at the 5-year financial plan to see what the total impact is for adding a lot of these positions that have been talked about.
I think so. I agree with, my position is the same as Steve's. I mean, we need the 5-year plan to see the sustainability of adding positions. It's hard to make these decisions without having that. So, but I would be in the same boat as Steve.
Okay.
I would be at keeping the levy 1422 currently, but I think the struggle as well as I'm listening to my colleagues up here with not knowing how, right, what we're wanting to do, how that will impact next year and the year after the year and the year after that, right? So it's easy for me to say, yeah, this is great right now, but I don't really know what that will mean for the next 2 to 5 years. So it would be really helpful in making these decisions. I would also be in support of keeping the franchise fee at 3% and not any higher than the 3% at this point. And doing the minimum of the 3 months reserve over a period of time that you think or we come up collectively together. That's where I am.
Okay.
I missed the reserve discussion, so if we could do a real quick.
Sure. In the utility funds, the only account that we actually have a set reserve requirement or policy with the city council is the general fund, which is 35%. There is no similar standard for the utility accounts, and so they've tended to be kind of all over the map as far as the amount that they have in there. So we just asked the council to consider setting a policy so that we have something to aim for. It's like with the sanitary sewer account right now, we're projecting to end the FY20 year with $263,000 in the bank. A 3-month operating reserve would dictate that we should actually have about $1.1 million in there. And there's a couple of reasons for having that. Marion has less exposure on some because we're not overly dependent on any 1 or 2 or 3 utility users for a big percentage of our book of business. But when we do things like go out and do a revenue bond, say for the eco-industrial park, they're going to have a reserve requirement for how much we have to have held in the event that for some reason we don't have enough money coming in to make a payment. So we want to make sure that we have enough dollars in there to be able to meet that requirement. Otherwise, what they'll do is they'll require you to add it to the bond, which just increases your debt payments, and you're actually, borrowing for your reserve.
And so what are the dollar amounts that were discussed over? So I see $1.51 over 4 years for sanitary sewer. Is that what that means?
If we wanted to increase the fund balance in sanitary sewer to $1 million over 4 years, we'd have to add $1.51 a month to be able to do that. But we had just picked that number as a potential one, taking a look at what we're going to be spending down other reserve funds in sanitary sewer and wanting to build this one up. But there's no hard and fast rule on it. It could be 6 years, it could be 8 years. It's whatever council's comfortable with.
I would be for doing that. I would also concur with them. Leave it to spoke to push that out as much as we can, so that it is a lower increase in the rate on the citizens. Excuse me, the utility fee. Couldn't think of the word for for a second.
Franchise fee?
Thank you, franchise fee. So what would going to 4% versus a 3%, would that fund 2 police officers?
We figured our rough estimate for each percent is it's between $333,000 and $350,000. So yeah, it would bring in more than that.
So I would say I would be for a 4% myself, because I would like to see 2 more officers, and I would like also to see the levy stay at the 1422. Is there another one that I needed to answer? Another topic.
Talk about the utility rates.
Okay.
You mentioned something early on. Got a 3rd floor in this building. And
the thought has occurred to me, I wonder, as unpopular as it might be, if we didn't have any renters in this building, how long would it prolong the use of the city using it?
When we have our space analysis done, it's going to have 2 scenarios. One is what it looks like with the current tenant mix, and one is what it looks like if we have use of the full building, just so we know what that is going to look like. I can say, from being on the Medco board, that Medco is taking a look at that. I mean, they know that they can't grow their staff or anything with their current footprint, and they're between the 3 organizations, Chamber, Main Street, and Medco, there isn't much they can do within their existing space. They've been talking about it. When we first approached them about it, they were looking at like a 5 to a 7 year time window. But Medco's executive committee and board, when they were looking at where they want to be in their next strategic plan, they asked Nick to put together their next budget as presupposing that they had increased their staff, and that would require a move.
Chamber's in the same situation. They have nowhere to grow to.
Yep. And that does dramatically change what we would potentially be looking at doing with our building. If you've been walking around, you've noticed that we've gotten fairly creative about the use of closets and former conference rooms to create additional space. But we know that there's more that can be done. It's just kind of beyond what we've got the capability of doing. And the one thing that we need to be aware of is that I can talk all day about putting a wall up, but it doesn't do me any good to put up a wall if then you have to go in and add thermostats and add zoning to heating and everything to be able to make it function correctly as an office. And that's where we need some help from an architect to be able to give us more guidance on what makes sense in the total scope of the project.
Just an observation, maybe a question about the idea of keeping, not raising the levy, the property tax levy, but increasing the franchise fee. That seems to me like it's more regressive, isn't it?
No, actually, when you do franchise fees are paid by every user, including every business. Right. And so while property taxes are levied according to property value, which is exclusive of ability to pay. With franchise fees, nonprofits, organizations that receive services also pay those. I'm going to see if I can find that breakdown that I did for it when we first talked about it 5 or 6 years ago. But there is, when you put the numbers together on balance, franchise fees, at least at the time, appeared to be more equitable than property taxes.
Okay.
Can I make a comment
Good to know.
That real quick?
Yeah.
Just nonprofits. Would assume that Four Oaks is a nonprofit, but they don't pay any property taxes to help pay for the police force. And how many hours have you spent with them over the last couple of years? So having a franchise fee that would help them also pay for the police force, fire. I mean,
in some way.
That's my thought.
At least in some way.
Yeah, I'm sure you get calls to churches and to schools and.
I get that.
More equitable?
Yeah. I was thinking of the individual.
Yep. Yeah, franchise fees are one of those things that within a certain amount, you do have some ability to influence. You know, you can set your thermostat how you want and make a choice that if you're going to set it at 76, well, you're going to tack a few cents onto the franchise fee versus setting it at 69. But there are amounts that you just flat out can't influence because you want to heat the place and keep it operating.
So now that we've
Latecomer may.
brought out all these considerations, what's your thoughts, Lon, on a higher franchise fee but not raising the levy?
The franchise fee at 4% would position us better to be able to absorb future operating cost increases for Fire Station 3 without having an impact on the levy. When I think about what that could do for the near term and for the next several years, it is something that gives us more flexibility to absorb what we know are going to be some coming expenses we just don't have estimates on yet. It has a hard cap. Statutory limit is 5%. So going to 4 does remove some of the flexibility that you have for yourself or future councils to be able to look at changing it again. But you do still have some room underneath that.
You can always go down, too.
I mean, yeah, you can always
Could always go down.
Yes, you can reduce it.
reduce it if you need to, but, I mean,
But the money for that, it goes into effect 6 months after city council approves it. So when is the soonest we could approve it? Is that the October date you were talking about? Is that might be kind of the
If we got through the
soonest we
entire,
would see any money coming in from that?
yeah, if we could get through the entire process by the end of April, October is about the earliest we'd see money coming in, at least from Alliant. That's the only one we've heard from so far.
Okay, so now I got one more question. Even if we really talked about adding 2 more police officers, and we started that today, when would you estimate we would find available qualified bodies?
The officers identified by June, academy starts in August, then I could probably have them off break-in by April of next year.
You'd find enough people, based on what you just talked about, you only found 2 qualified.
2 out of 20.
Out of that entire list, and you're talking about adding, oh no, that's.
Right. We're going to get lateral transfers from KCPD, and yeah.
Okay.
It'll be a stretch because we've got 1 vacancy right now that we're trying to hire for,
Right.
and then to add 2 on top of that, and that's why I just want to make sure that in respect to the city manager, that's why I did this plan. That's why I wanted to go out 5 years. Just hearing the conversations, it's not going to get better for his job in the coming years, and that's and I know the growth we're going to incur is going to demand police service, and so it's my job to make sure that I do the best job that I can for y'all, so you guys can plan out, and so that's just my only position here is to try to make sure that I'm doing what best to get him the information he needs over the next 5 years. But also for the service delivery quote, that the citizens of this town expect from that agency. It's very high, and it's very high, and I'm going to keep it that way.
So there's been more discussion here, I'm hearing, about do we want to consider going to a 4% franchise and then keeping it at 1422? And I can understand some merit behind that.
Not if we can keep it at 1422 and 3%. I think we should let them see what they can do before we just automatically bump up a percent. That's a lot of dollars in there to move around and just.
I understand. I do believe at this point in time that Lon and all of the staff have already. Again, I've done enough budgets in detail, being in his position as CEO, knowing the process he's already gone through, that if you got to slash again, it's going to be hurting. You ask these directors and our fire chief and police chief, you have to cut again to get it down to that level. You're going to be taking some other things out that you're not going to want to take out, or they may not want to take out.
Well,
So they're already making some decisions that they may regret.
The
Put it that
key to it is that, you know, I have a responsibility to not present to the council a budget that isn't sustainable. So if you want to put 2 positions in, and we know what that cost is, the only items that we could cut at this point have to be ones that are an ongoing expense related to operations. I can't endorse using one-time money or drawing against reserves or something like that to be able to fund positions, because then you're banking against future growth in order to be able to fund it. So at that point, you're talking about what are annual operating expenses that you can potentially cut. And keep in mind, you know, yes, there's training expenses and everything associated with it, but when you bring personnel on, you do have other items associated with it. You have a Microsoft 365 license. You have other pieces that get attached to them that roll up that aren't always necessarily readily apparent. So, you know, the $27,000 might be their training costs getting them out the door, but there is another little increment that has to be added into that. And I just wouldn't want to endorse using any time of one-time budget tricks or something like that just to make this fiscal year look good without consideration to what it looks like the year after that.
That's right, exactly. Agree with that.
Lon, have we, you know, I'm just looking at the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. The average over 10 years was 1.8%. I know we can't leverage it against this, but where do you, maybe that's maybe a ridiculous question. I'm just trying to think of where, you know, from a payroll standpoint, what kind of dollars we're talking about in that particular category.
I think Zach had figured that it was at every 0.5% on pay for performance is about $37,000 on the general fund side,
Yeah.
and about another 10 in the proprietary fund side.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you figure 1%, 74,000. Okay. Any other last minute observations? The one thing I will say on the franchise fee side is, you know, we're budgeting for that revenue at 3%. After you hold the hearing and after you adopt it, if we look at it and council says you want to do 4, you have that option, you have that alternative. It's not until you actually adopt the ordinance to enact it that that you have to have that decision be absolutely final. So I think we can model it both ways and let you see what that looks like. You'd like to see that, but just have to think of how we frame that for getting the publication in the paper. I think I would propose that we would put it in at 3% and then have the discussion with council about it, what it looks like at 4.
Would we have another public hearing if we decide to push it up to 4? It just seems disingenuous that we would say 3 if we're considering 4, and then the public comes and we debate 3, and we pass it, and we submit it, and then we raise it to 4 without another open period.
I believe it actually requires a separate hearing during the adoption process.
Is there anything you wanted us to discuss further so you can have, or is it, or do you feel like you have a clear idea of a consensus, or do we need to discuss amongst us anything more in particular?
No, I think we've covered all the different pieces that we need in order to be able to frame it up. There clearly wasn't support for using the emergency levy. It seems like the consensus of the group. There were a couple of you that were comfortable with the 1422, but I'm seeing more, or 1426, but I'm seeing more that would like to be at the 1422. And then the only other question would be is if we go to 1422, at 1422, do we have to contemplate looking at 4% franchise fee? The other thing I'll investigate, I have to do some checking. I'm not 100% sure if the franchise fee can only be done in even increments, or if you could contemplate like a 3.2 or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. I need to check on that. I know that's splitting hairs, but I can find out.
Okay.
Good stewards.
Anyone have anything else?
Other than, thank you.
Go ahead.
I mean, this was a lot of work for all of you, so I just really want us to, I mean, we recognize that.
It is a lot of work.
We've asked a lot of hard questions, and, but do know that we certainly appreciate all the work that you have all put into this, so really, thank you.
It's not easy, and we appreciate all the hard work that's gone into it. And I appreciate all the council members' thoughtfulness and taking the time to think about these things. It is a very important process, and the process we're using has improved a lot, and I think that says a lot. And I'm sure that we'll end up with something that everyone's happy with. So.
Actually, I always think the best budget is the one that nobody's ever completely happy
Correct.
with.
I mean, but we can all live with. So it's not easy, and it's a lot of competing interests and very limited resources. So thank you, everyone, for all your hard work, and we're adjourned.